Welcome, weary traveler, to this quiet sanctuary of time and memory. Tonight, the world outside your door begins to slow its pace, the relentless rush of the day dissolving into the gentle, cool shadows of the evening. Wherever you are resting, let your shoulders drop. Allow the tension held within your mind to soften, like mist dispersing over a calm, dark river. There is nothing more you need to accomplish today. No tasks await your attention. No problems require your focus. For the next few hours, your only purpose is to exist in this stillness, to breathe deeply, and to let your consciousness drift backward, far beyond the horizon of the modern world. Tonight, we are stepping into a realm where time moves differently. We are journeying to a land sculpted by the sun and anchored by stone, a kingdom so unimaginably old that even the empires of antiquity looked upon it with a sense of distant wonder. We are wandering into the heart of ancient Egypt, but we do not visit it as historians rushing through a museum. We come as quiet observers, walking beneath a canopy of eternal stars, listening to the soft rustle of reeds along a sacred river, and feeling the profound, heavy silence of monuments that have watched the world turn for millennia. As you settle deeper into your blankets, let the rhythm of my voice become a gentle anchor. If your mind wanders, let it wander. If your eyes grow heavy, close them. Let these words wash over you like a warm desert breeze, guiding you into a deep, restorative sleep. To understand the land we are visiting tonight, we must first unlearn how we measure the passing of years. In our modern lives, we count time in minutes, days, and fleeting seasons. In Egypt, time was measured in dynasties, in the slow shifting of riverbeds, and in the eternal reign of the sun. The sheer duration of this civilization is almost beyond human comprehension. It is a striking truth of history that the legendary Queen Cleopatra, who ruled during the final twilight years of independent Egypt, lived closer in time to the invention of the smartphone and the building of modern cities than she did to the architects who raised the Great Pyramid of Giza. When Cleopatra looked upon those colossal stone structures shimmering on the horizon, she was not looking at contemporary monuments of her culture. She was gazing at relics of a past that was already thousands of years old to her. The pyramids were as ancient to her as the Roman Empire is to us today. This is the staggering scale of Egypt. It was not a single moment in time, nor was it a brief flash of cultural brilliance. It was a slow-burning miracle of continuity that endured for more than 3,000 years. Empires across the Mediterranean rose from nothing, conquered the known world, crumbled into dust, and were forgotten, all while the same sacred rituals were being performed along the banks of the Nile. Dozens of dynasties held the throne, hundreds of pharaohs wore the double crown, and countless generations lived, loved, and returned to the earth. Yet the foundational spirit of the land remained unbroken. It was an anchor of stability in a changing world, a civilization that built its entire identity upon the concept of changelessness. Imagine standing at the edge of the desert, just as the sun begins to dip below the western horizon. The intense heat of the day is fading, replaced by a soothing, velvety coolness that rises from the sand. The sky above you transitions through a breathtaking spectrum of colors: deep amber, bruised violet, and finally, a rich, infinite indigo. In this quiet hour, the landscape reveals its true nature. It is a world divided strictly in two, a physical manifestation of balance that the ancients called mad. On one side lies the narrow strip of black, fertile earth, hugged closely by the life-giving waters of the river. On the other side, stretching out into the vast unknown, are the crimson and golden dunes of the high desert. This desert was not merely empty space to the people who lived here. It was the great frontier of eternity. It was a shield that protected their kingdom from outside invasions. But it was also the sacred ground where stone was quarried and where the dead were laid to rest in the dry, preserving embrace of the earth. As you look out across this landscape in your mind's eye, you can feel the profound stillness that defines it. The desert does not rush. It does not clamor for attention. It simply endures, holding the secrets of millions of souls beneath its shifting sands, waiting in absolute silence as the ages pass by. As the darkness deepens, the stars begin to appear, one by one, piercing the velvet sky with a brilliant, diamond-like clarity that is rarely seen in our modern world. To the ancient observers who stood in this very spot thousands of years ago, the night sky was not an empty void, but a celestial ocean, a divine canvas where the gods reenacted the story of creation every single night. They watched the constellations move with absolute precision, noting how certain stars disappeared below the horizon only to rise again months later, perfectly synchronized with the changing of the seasons. The most important of these celestial guardians was the bright star Sirius. For months, it would remain hidden from view, completely absent from the night sky. But then, on one specific dawn in midsummer, just before the sun broke over the eastern horizon, Sirius would reappear, a brilliant spark of silver in the early morning twilight. To the watchers on Earth, this was the most sacred signal of the year. It was the herald of the renewal of life, a cosmic promise that the river would soon swell with fresh, nutrient-rich waters from the south. This intimate connection between the movements of the heavens and the survival of the earth shaped the very soul of Egypt. They did not view themselves as separate from nature, nor did they see the universe as a collection of random events. Everything was connected in a beautiful, grand design. The stars turned, the river flowed, the sun rose, and humanity walked in harmony with the rhythm of eternity. Take a deep breath in, feeling the cool, still air fill your lungs, and let it out slowly, releasing any remaining thoughts of the present day. Allow yourself to sink further into the mattress, visualizing the vast, quiet expanses of the ancient valley. In this world, the concept of a ruler was entirely different from the kings and emperors of later history. The individual who sat upon the throne of Egypt was not merely a politician, a military commander, or a man born into wealth. They were a living bridge between the mortal realm and the infinite cosmos. When a pharaoh ascended to the throne, they ceased to be viewed as an ordinary human being. They became the earthly manifestation of Horus, the sky god, the divine protector of order. It was the pharaoh's sacred duty to maintain the cosmic balance of truth, justice, and cosmic harmony. If the king ruled with wisdom and honored the gods, the cosmos would respond in kind. The sun would rise on schedule, the crops would flourish, and the boundaries of the kingdom would remain secure. The pharaoh was the ultimate guardian of the people, a shepherd responsible for the spiritual and physical well-being of millions. In exchange for this heavy burden, they were surrounded by an aura of absolute majesty. Their image was carved into the living rock of mountains. Their names were written in sacred symbols that carried the weight of magic, and their movements were dictated by a strict cycle of rituals that mirrored the daily journey of the sun. To look upon the pharaoh was to look upon the divine order made flesh, a reassuring sign that the world was functioning exactly as it was intended to since the beginning of time. Let your mind drift closer to one of these ancient rulers, visualizing them not in the heat of battle, but in a moment of quiet reflection within the shaded courtyards of their palace. The air is heavy with the scent of burning blue lotus and frankincense, curling lazily upward toward a ceiling painted with the likeness of the night sky. The pharaoh sits upon a throne of dark ebony inlaid with gleaming gold and shimmering electrum. In their hands, they hold the sacred emblems of their office, the crook and the flail. These were not weapons of destruction, but symbols of deep philosophical meaning. The crook, with its gentle, rounded hook, was derived from the staff of a humble shepherd. It was a reminder that the ruler must guide the people with patience, protecting the vulnerable and leading the nation toward fertile pastures of peace. The flail, a tool used to separate grain from chaff, represented the necessity of discipline, strength, and the enforcement of justice. Together, these two objects perfectly encapsulated the delicate balance required of leadership, the tenderness of a protector combined with the unyielding resolve of a judge. As the pharaoh holds these symbols across their chest, they are not just a person, they are an archetype of stability. They are the fixed point around which the entire kingdom turns, a manifestation of human ambition reaching toward the divine, ensuring that order prevails over the chaotic forces that constantly threaten the edges of existence. Yet, despite this immense, god-like power in the mortal world, the pharaoh was ultimately subject to the same eternal laws as the humblest farmer who tilled the soil along the riverbanks. Divinity in Egypt did not grant immunity from moral accountability. When the king's eyes finally closed for the last time, and their earthly breath faded into the desert air, their spirit began a journey toward the great hall of judgment. In that silent, shadowed realm beneath the earth, surrounded by 42 divine judges, the pharaoh would stand stripped of their golden crowns, their grand titles, and their vast armies. They would stand as a pure soul, presenting their heart to be weighed upon the cosmic scales of Anubis. The heart, which the ancients believed held the complete record of a person's deeds, thoughts, and true character, would be placed on one side of the scale. On the other side sat the delicate, white feather of Mad, the ultimate standard of truth and harmony. If the pharaoh had ruled with cruelty, if their heart was heavy with deceit, greed, or pride, the scales would tip, and their existence would be extinguished forever. Power in this life was fleeting, a temporary stewardship granted by the gods. True immortality had to be earned through a life walked in alignment with truth. This knowledge infused the entire civilization with a profound sense of moral purpose. No one, not even the most powerful being on Earth, was above the final judgment of the cosmos. As you continue to relax, letting the gentle cadence of these ancient truths soothe your mind, imagine walking toward the horizon where the earth meets the sky. There, rising from the desert plateau like mountains carved by human hands, stand the Great Pyramids. Today, we see them as weathered stone structures, beautiful in their golden decay. But close your eyes and imagine them as they appeared when they were newly completed, thousands of years ago. They did not look like rough stairs of rock. They were entirely encased in thousands of blocks of highly polished Tura limestone, fitted together so precisely that the seams were virtually invisible to the naked eye. The surface was as smooth as glass and as white as driven snow. When the intense Egyptian sun struck the sides of the pyramid, the monument did not merely reflect the light. It seemed to radiate it, glowing with a dazzling, blinding brilliance that could be seen from miles away across the valley. It was a beacon of pure light rising from the shifting sands, a physical manifestation of the sun's rays frozen in stone. At the very peak of the structure sat the pyramidion, a capstone often covered in electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver. As the first rays of dawn broke over the eastern mountains, the capstone would catch the light, while the rest of the world was still shrouded in twilight, flashing like a star brought down to earth, signaling to all who looked upon it that the divine light had returned to dispel the darkness of the night. The sheer engineering genius required to create these structures remains one of the greatest stories of human determination ever told. At a time when the world was largely unformed, without the aid of iron tools, cranes, or complex machinery, the architects of the Old Kingdom conceived a project of staggering proportions. Millions of massive stone blocks, each weighing several tons, had to be quarried from the earth, transported across the river, and hoisted to heights that would not be surpassed by humanity for nearly 40 centuries. But the miracle of the pyramids lies not just in their size, but in their mind-boggling precision. The base of the Great Pyramid is aligned almost perfectly with the 4 cardinal points of the compass: north, south, east, and west, with an error so microscopic that it rivals the work of modern satellite technology. The massive foundation, covering 13 acres of uneven desert terrain, was leveled to within a fraction of an inch. Every stone was placed with a deliberate, mathematical intent, It was not a chaotic pile of rocks, but a highly sophisticated cosmic engine, a structure built to channel the alignment of the stars and anchor the presence of the king for eternity. To stand in the shadow of such a monument is to realize that the people who built it did not view themselves as temporary visitors on this planet. They were building for a future that stretched beyond the end of time itself, creating an unyielding statement of human capability that would endure long after their names had faded into whisper. Let your breath slow down even further, matching the deep, slow rhythm of the ancient earth. Let go of the need to understand every detail and simply allow the imagery to construct a peaceful landscape within your mind. Beside the great pyramids, resting quietly in the sand, sits the great Sphinx. For thousands of years, this colossal figure has gazed eastward, watching the sun rise over the valley day after day, century after century. Carved out of a single, massive outcrop of living limestone that was left behind by the pyramid quarrymen, the Sphinx possesses the body of a crouching lion and the head of a human ruler. It is the ultimate symbol of ancient wisdom, the raw, untamed physical power of the king of beasts combined with the sharp, divine intelligence of a pharaoh. For vast stretches of history, the desert sands would claim the Sphinx, drifting up its sides, until only the enigmatic head was visible above the dunes, a lonely sentinel watching over a buried past. Scholars and travelers from distant lands would stand before it, marveling at its calm, unreadable expression. Who carved this monumental guardian? Whose face does it bear? The passage of time has worn away its features, and the secrets of its origin remain locked within the stone. The Sphinx does not speak. It does not offer explanations to the curious crowds that visit its feet. It simply watches, an eternal witness to the rise and fall of civilizations, embodying the quiet, enduring spirit of an age that refused to be forgotten. As the night deepens and the world grows completely still, let yourself drift into the quiet confidence of these ancient structures. They were built to survive the wind, the sand, and the slow erosion of the ages, just as your mind is now finding its way to a place of deep, undisturbed rest. The stories of the pharaohs, the alignment of the stars, and the brilliant white stones of the pyramids are all turning slowly in the quiet space of your dreams. You are safe in this stillness, protected by the heavy, comforting weight of history. The journey has only just begun, but for now, there is nothing left to do but surrender to the dark, peaceful currents of sleep. Let the desert wind carry away the last of your thoughts and sleep. Sleep deeply beneath the eternal canopy of the past. As you rest deeply within the quiet embrace of the night, let your imagination travel further up the sacred river, moving against the gentle current into the heart of Upper Egypt. The modern world remains far behind, an insignificant whisper in the grand theater of time. Here, the air is thick with the scent of river loam and nocturnal blooms, and the silhouette of the landscape is defined by structures that seem to bridge the gap between the earthly and the divine. The heavy stone walls of temples stand like cliffs against the starlit sky, their surfaces deeply etched with stories that have survived the passing of countless empires. Allow your breathing to remain slow and rhythmic, matching the timeless pulse of this ancient valley as we explore the magnificent creation of the monoliths of light and the majestic rulers who commanded them. Away from the massive plateaus of the pyramids, standing guard at the magnificent gateways of sprawling temple complexes, rose the obelisks. These were not merely pillars or decorative towers. They were monolithic shafts of pure intention, carved from single, unbroken pieces of solid red granite quarried from the deep south in Aswan. To the ancients, these monuments were known as tekenu, a word that spoke of piercing the protective canopy of the sky. The engineering required to bring these giants into existence stretches the limits of imagination. Master stonecutters would spend months in the scorching quarries, pounding the stubborn granite with heavy balls of dolerite, slowly freeing a single, perfect column from the bedrock. A single misstep, a microscopic fracture in the stone, and months of exhausting labor would be rendered useless. Once freed, these immense monoliths, often weighing hundreds of tons, were carefully rolled onto massive wooden sledges and moved to the riverbanks. There, during the high flood season, they were floated onto specially constructed cedarwood barges, navigating the deep waters of the Nile to their final destinations in sacred cities like Thebes and Heliopolis. To raise a single piece of stone 90 feet into the air using only ropes, sand ramps, and raw human coordination was a triumph of geometry and willpower. When finally erected, their tapering sides were polished until they smooth as glass, and their pointed tips, the pyramidions, were clad in sheets of shimmering electrum. Standing perfectly vertical beneath the expansive sky, the obelisks acted as cosmic anchors. As the darkness of night began to break, the gilded peak of the obelisk would catch the absolute first ray of dawn, flashing brilliantly over the sleeping city, while the streets below were still cloaked in shadow, a silent declaration that light had once again triumphed over the dark. The individuals who commanded the creation of these grand monuments were the pharaohs of the new kingdom, rulers who combined the spiritual authority of a god with the unyielding strategic mind of a warrior. We often envision these ancient kings as static figures frozen in golden masks, distant and unmoving. But the reality of their lives was one of immense movement, responsibility, and physical bravery. Rulers like Thutmose Roman III, often remembered as one of the greatest military minds of the ancient world, did not govern from the safety of a secluded palace. When the borders of the kingdom were threatened, or when the chaotic forces of foreign empires sought to disrupt the balance of Mad, the pharaoh mounted his gilded chariot and rode at the absolute vanguard of his army. Visualize the sheer majesty of a royal campaign moving through the dusty corridors of the Levant or the rugged terrains of the south. The pharaoh stood tall in his chariot, the reins of his magnificent stallions tied securely around his waist, freeing his hands to draw a massive composite bow. On his brow rested the blue war crown, catching the glint of the fierce sun. To the soldiers who marched beneath his banners, the pharaoh was not merely a general. He was an unstoppable force of nature, an earthly extension of the sun god's righteous power sent to restore order to a fractured world. Victory in battle was not viewed as a personal achievement, but as a cosmic necessity. Every successful campaign, every secured border, and every tribute brought back to the treasury was proof that the gods favored the land, ensuring that the delicate harmony of life could continue undisturbed for another generation. Among these legendary warrior kings, none cast a longer shadow across the sand than Ramesses Roman II, known to history as Ramesses the Great. Ruling for an astonishing 66 years, his reign became the very definition of Egyptian majesty and stability. He was a master of self-preservation and grand scale, dotting the entire length of the Nile with colossal likenesses of himself. His most breathtaking achievement remains the great temple of Abu Simbel, hewn directly into the living heart of a towering sandstone cliff in the remote south. 4 monumental statues of Ramesses, each 60 feet tall, sit in absolute serenity against the mountain face, staring out across the waters with an expression of timeless, unbothered authority. But the true magic of Abu Simbel lies deep within its dark, subterranean halls. The temple was designed with such mathematical and astronomical precision that twice every year, on dates corresponding closely to the king's birthday and his ascension to the throne, the rays of the rising sun would pierce through the narrow entrance. The light would travel over 180 feet through the dark, pillared caverns, illuminating the hidden sanctuary at the very back of the mountain. There, in a spectacular display of celestial theater, the golden light would wash over the statues of the gods and Ramesses himself, transforming the cold, silent stone into a radiant showcase of divine validation. It was a message written in light and rock, a statement that the pharaoh's power was woven into the very fabric of the cosmos. renewed by the sun itself twice a year for all eternity. As you contemplate the immense power of these kings, let your mind drift to the quiet spaces behind the grand history, down to the people whose hands actually shaped these wonders. For generations, popular myths have painted a dark picture of the pyramid and temple builders, portraying them as masses of nameless slaves working under the cruel lash of foreign tyrants. But modern archaeology has unearthed a far more beautiful and human truth. The individuals who raised the mountains of stone were highly skilled artisans, dedicated craftsmen, and free laborers who took immense pride in their sacred work. Excavations near the Giza Plateau have revealed the remnants of vast, well-organized workers' villages. These were not temporary slave camps, but bustling communities complete with bakeries, breweries, medical facilities, and comfortable family homes. The builders were well compensated for their monumental efforts, receiving regular rations of high-quality beef, fresh fish, vegetables, and abundance of thick, nutritious beer. They were cared for by the state. Skeletons of workers show advanced medical treatments, including successfully set fractures and complex bone surgeries that allowed them to heal and continue their lives. Constructing a monument for the pharaoh was viewed as a grand national project, a form of spiritual devotion where every citizen played a vital role. When a worker chiseled a block of limestone or guided a sledge across the sand, they were not just laboring for a mortal king. They were contributing to the eternal preservation of their entire civilization, ensuring that their corner of the earth remained anchored to the divine order. Let the images of the grand obelisks, the majestic warrior kings, and the proud artisans of the valley slowly soften within your consciousness. The intense sun of the ancient world is setting now, giving way to the cool, protective dark of the evening. The massive stone monuments, built to survive the passing of eons, stand silent beneath the spinning constellations, their long shadows stretching across the peaceful desert sand. You are completely safe, resting in the quiet sanctuary of the present, while the enduring spirit of the past stands watch over your rest. There are no kingdoms to conquer tonight, no monuments to build, and no tasks to complete. Allow your mind to release the last of its thoughts, sinking deeper into the soft, warm currents of a deep and restorative sleep. Let the timeless rhythm of the ancient land guide you into comfort as you sleep. Sleep deeply beneath the eternal stars. Let the quiet weight of the night settle comfortably around you, like a soft cloak woven from the shadows of the desert. The modern world continues to recede, its noise fading into absolute insignificance. Your breath remains your steady, peaceful companion, a slow, rhythmic tide that rises and falls, echoing the ancient movements of the valley. In this quiet space between wakefulness and dreams, we turn our gaze toward those rare moments in history when the traditional order of Egypt was challenged, not by foreign invaders, but from within the royal palace itself. We step into an era of radical visions, hidden legacies, and grand cities built upon the shifting sands of political and spiritual necessity. The king, who was a woman deep within the rugged, sun-bleached cliffs of western Thebes, a magnificent architectural marvel, stands as a monument to one of the most extraordinary rulers the ancient world ever knew. This is the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari. Unlike the towering, heavy pylons of other pharaohs, her temple rises in a series of elegant, colonnaded terraces that seem to grow organically from the face of the living mountain, a perfect marriage of human geometry and natural stone. Hatshepsut was not merely a queen sitting quietly behind a male monarch. She was a sovereign who claimed the full, absolute power of the pharaoh, ruling over a golden age of peace, prosperity, and monumental artistic achievement that lasted for more than 2 decades. To establish her authority in a society deeply rooted in patriarchal tradition, Hatshepsut understood that she had to embody the timeless archetype of kingship completely. In her official statues and relief carvings, she did not hide her gender, Yet she commanded artists to depict her with the sacred, traditional regalia of office. She wore the royal kilt, the heavy crown, and even the ceremonial braided false beard fastened to her chin, a sacred symbol designed to link the living ruler directly to Osiris, the lord of the afterlife. This was not a deceptive disguise, but a ritual uniform. By donning the beard, she transformed from an individual woman into a divine instrument of Mad, a living god walking among mortals. Under her wise stewardship, Egypt put aside the weapons of war and focused its vast energy outward on trade, diplomacy, and exploration. Her most famous triumph was a grand maritime expedition down the coast of the Red Sea to the legendary, wealthy land of Punt. A fleet of majestic Egyptian longboats navigated uncharted waters, returning to the docks of Thebes laden with exotic treasures. Rich ebony, pure gold, strange animals, and heavy baskets filled with living myrrh trees, their roots carefully wrapped in wet soil. The walls of her cliffside temple still preserve the vivid, beautifully painted stories of this journey, allowing us to breathe across the millennia the scent of the sacred incense that once perfumed her grand courtyards. Yet, despite her undeniable greatness and the profound stability she brought to the nation, an invisible storm gathered over her legacy after her spirit departed for the fields of eternity. For reasons that still spark intense debate among historians, subsequent rulers launched a systematic campaign of damnatio memoriae, a deliberate attempt to completely erase her existence from the physical fabric of history. Stonemasons marched into her temples with chisels and hammers, systematically scratching her sacred name from the walls, shattering her beautiful limestone statues into countless fragments, and walling up her magnificent obelisks to hide them from public view. In the spiritual warfare of ancient Egypt, to lose your carved name was to be denied a place in eternity, a fate considered far worse than physical death. For centuries, the silence of the desert held her secret, until modern archaeology painstakingly pieced her broken statues back together, lifting her name from the dust and allowing the voice of this magnificent king to echo once more across the sands of time. The heretic of the sun disk, as you sink deeper into the stillness of your rest, let the imagery of Hatshepsut's elegant terraces gently fade, making room for an even more radical chapter in the story of the Nile. A few generations after the merchant queen, a young pharaoh ascended the throne under the name Amenhotep Roman IV. But he would not keep that name for long. In a sudden, earth-shattering move that shocked the powerful priesthoods and upended thousands of years of religious tradition, he declared that the ancient pantheon of gods, Amun, Osiris, Isis, and Thoth, were no longer to be worshipped. He changed his name to Akhenaten and proclaimed that there was only one true, supreme deity, the Aten, the literal physical disk of the sun. For nearly 2 decades, Egypt became a monotheistic kingdom, governed by the singular, intense vision of this heretic king. Akhenaten closed the ancient, wealthy temples, confiscated the vast lands of the traditional priests, and ordered the name of Amun to be chiseled out wherever it appeared, even from the private tombs of his own ancestors. To fully separate his new world from the heavy traditions of the past, he abandoned the historic capitals and led thousands of his followers out into a remote, untouched stretch of the desert canvas. There, he built a brand new capital city from absolute nothingness, Akhetaten, meaning the horizon of the Aten. This fleeting desert city was designed as a paradise of light. Unlike the dark, mysterious inner sanctuaries of traditional temples, the open-air shrines of Akhetaten were flooded with the brilliant, unhindered rays of the daytime sun. The art of this period shifted dramatically, abandoning the rigid, idealized perfection of the past in favor of a fluid, deeply intimate, and expressive style. For the first time, the pharaoh was depicted not as an unmoving colossus, but as a human being, cradling his children, holding the hand of his beautiful queen, Nefertiti, and basking beneath the long, streaming rays of the Aten, which artists drew ending in tiny human hands that gently offered the breath of life to the royal family. But a revolution built upon the willpower of a single man is a fragile thing. When Akhenaten's earthly breath finally faded into the desert air, the weight of thousands of years of tradition came crashing back down. The old gods returned with an unstoppable fury. His young son, who would become famous to the modern world as Tutankhamun, was guided by the restored priesthood to abandon the desert experiment and return the capital to the ancient centers of power. The city of Akhetaten was completely abandoned, left to crumble back into the quiet dust from which it came. Just as they had done to Hatshepsut, the architects of the restoration chiseled Akhenaten's name from the monuments, omitted him from the official lists of kings, and treated his reign as a chaotic nightmare that had to be forgotten. Yet, the ruins of his sun-drenched city remain a haunting, beautiful glimpse into a brief moment when an entire civilization paused, broke its own ancient rules, and reached for the stars in a completely new way. The shifting spine of empire, this constant tension between tradition and transformation, is perfectly reflected in the geography of Egypt's great capital cities. Unlike modern nations that anchor their identity to a single, permanent metropolis, the seat of pharaonic power moved repeatedly throughout history, flowing along the spine of the Nile like the current of the river itself. Each time a new dynasty rose, or a spiritual shift altered the course of the kingdom, the capital shifted to reflect the soul of the rulers. Memphis, the ancient northern anchor, situated at the strategic scales of the nation, right where the narrow valley of Upper Egypt widens into the vast, fertile delta of Lower Egypt, Memphis was the legendary capital of the Old Kingdom kings. It was a bustling, cosmopolitan metropolis of white-walled palaces, massive markets, and sprawling estates, placed perfectly to control the trade routes that connected Egypt to the wider Mediterranean world. Thebes, the spiritual powerhouse of the south, located hundreds of miles to the south, tucked securely within a grand bend of the river, Thebes rose to prominence during times of national revival and military triumph. It was the sacred city of Ammon, a place dominated by the gargantuan temple complexes of Karnak and Luxor, where the air was perpetually thick with the smoke of offerings, and the wealth of empires flowed directly into the treasuries of the gods. Akhetaten, the fleeting dream. The short-lived city of Akhenaten, built out of the virgin sand in the middle of the kingdom, serving as a bright, temporary spark of monotheistic devotion before being swallowed once more by the silence of the desert. Alexandria, the final, shimmering chapter. Built on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea by the Greek generals who inherited the empire, Alexandria served as a gleaming, intellectual capital where the ancient traditions of the pharaohs merged with the philosophy, science, and maritime power of the classical world. Each of these moves left behind an incredible trail of monuments, memories, and profound mysteries. They remind us that ancient Egypt was never a frozen, static museum. It was a living, breathing, and highly adaptive culture that knew how to reinvent itself across 3 millennia, anchoring its changing human ambitions to the eternal, unchanging rhythm of the sacred river. With the collapse of Akhenaten's radiant sun city, the responsibility of restoring the ancient balance of the world fell upon the fragile shoulders of his very young successor, a boy king whose name would eventually echo louder across modern history than almost any other ruler of the Nile. This child monarch was Tutankhamun, who ascended the grand throne during a time of immense political and spiritual uncertainty, ruling for less than a short decade and tragically passing away before he could even reach full adulthood. In the grand tapestry of Egyptian history, his brief reign was modest, heavily overshadowed by the monumental achievements of legendary warrior pharaohs and massive builders who left their marks deep in the living rock. Yet, by a miraculous twist of fate, He became the ultimate global symbol of pharaonic majesty, not because of the great deeds he accomplished in his life, but because of the profound secrets his tomb managed to keep safe from the outside world for thousands of years. Unlike the final resting places of almost every other great ruler, which were systematically stripped and plundered by tomb robbers across the centuries, Tutankhamun's sacred chamber remained completely untouched, safely hidden away beneath the accumulating desert sands. When the British archaeologist Howard Carter finally cleared away the final layer of rock and uncovered the sealed doorway in the Valley of the Kings in the year 1922, he pulled back the curtain on an ancient royal burial exactly as it had been left by the weeping priests 3,000 years prior. Stepping into the dark, silent rooms, the modern world gazed in absolute awe at a shimmering wonderland of eternity, filled to the ceiling with golden shrines, delicate alabaster vases, grand royal chariots, watchful statues, and the iconic funerary mask of breathtaking beauty that had guarded the young king's peaceful slumber across the millennia. Through this incredible preservation, a quiet boy king who had been intentionally omitted from some later historic records, transformed into an immortal messenger, showing the modern world the true, dazzling reality of what it meant to be buried in the style of a god. This profound shift in how Tutankhamun was buried represents a much larger, desperate evolution in the architecture of eternity that took place during the prosperous years of the New Kingdom. For many centuries, the mighty pharaohs of the past had raised towering, unmistakable pyramids against the flat desert horizon, structures that proudly screamed their divine presence to the world. However, these magnificent stone mountains proved to be far too obvious to ignore, practically serving as giant beacons that invited generation after generation of clever and determined thieves to break through the heavy stone blocks and loot the treasures hidden within. Recognizing that their sacred earthly remains were incredibly vulnerable to desecration, the later dynasties made a radical, quiet change in their grand strategy for survival. Instead of building massive structures that climbed proudly upward toward the clouds, they decided to bury their legacies deep into the earth, turning their architectural focus entirely inward. They chose a desolate, secret canyon hidden deep within the western desert cliffs, a silent cemetery that would become known to history as the Valley of the Kings. From the barren, dusty surface of these rugged cliffs, the tombs were completely invisible, their narrow entrances carefully disguised with loose rubble and guarded by trusted patrols. Yet, once a person descended past the threshold and entered the subterranean world, the cold rock gave way to a breathtaking explosion of color and spiritual magic. The long, winding corridors were meticulously carved straight into the sandstone, their walls completely covered in brilliant plaster and painted with vivid maps of the underworld, protective spells, and ceilings adorned with thousands of white stars to ensure the king would rest beneath a celestial canopy forever. This historical pivot marked a beautiful deepening of cosmic secrecy, a quiet realization that true immortality did not require a mountain of stone to show its power, but could be found resting peacefully beneath the heavy, protective bones of the earth itself. As the long centuries rolled on, and the grand capitals continued to shift, this ancient land eventually found itself drifting toward its final, heartbreaking chapter, where its legendary independence would fade into the rising tide of Mediterranean empires. At the absolute center of this dramatic twilight stood Queen Cleopatra VII, a ruler who inherited a fractured, rapidly fading empire that was constantly being squeezed by the immense military and political weight of Rome. Though she sat upon the traditional throne of the pharaohs and fully embraced the complex religious rituals of the Nile, Cleopatra was not actually Egyptian by blood. She was the proud descendant of Macedonian Greek royalty, tracing her lineage directly back to Ptolemy, one of the legendary generals who had conquered the region under Alexander the Great. Yet, she possessed a fierce love for the kingdom she governed, breaking centuries of family tradition by becoming the very first ruler in her entire Greek dynasty to learn and speak the native Egyptian language fluently. Highly intelligent, exceptionally charming, and gifted with a sharp, calculating political will, she understood that her kingdom could only survive if she formed powerful alliances with the most influential men in the expanding Roman world. She wove her fate intimately with the lives of Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony, using her strategic wit to shield Egypt from direct conquest for as long as humanly possible. But when her grand political gamble ultimately collapsed at the hands of Octavian, and her forces were decisively defeated, she chose to take her own life rather than suffer the ultimate humiliation of being paraded through the crowded streets of Rome as a captured prize. With her final, tragic breath, the independent history of ancient Egypt officially came to an end, and the fertile valley was formally absorbed as a wealthy province of the Roman Empire. She was the last true pharaoh, a brilliant queen who stood defiantly in the shifting spaces between entirely different cultures, guarding the flame of an ancient world just before it was swallowed by the dark currents of a new age. Following her death, as the old temples were gradually shuttered, and the ancient priesthoods slowly dissolved into the expanding fabric of the Roman world, the ability to read the sacred writing of the pharaohs completely vanished from human memory. For nearly 2,000 years, the magnificent hieroglyphs carved into the heavy temple walls and painted onto fragile papyrus scrolls remained entirely silent, viewed by travelers as nothing more than mysterious magical symbols whose true meanings were lost to time. The voices of the ancient scribes had fallen completely quiet, trapped behind a thick wall of linguistic obscurity that no scholar could seem to crack. But in the year 1799, near the town of Rosetta, soldiers uncovered a heavy slab of black granite that would completely change the course of historical discovery forever. This remarkable artifact, which became globally famous as the Rosetta Stone, was inscribed with a singular royal decree repeated in 3 entirely distinct scripts: ancient Greek, Demotic, and the sacred hieroglyphs of the old gods. Because scholars already possessed a deep understanding of ancient Greek, this broken stone provided the ultimate comparative key, allowing brilliant minds over decades of exhausting work to slowly decode the forgotten script of the pharaohs. When the wall of silence finally cracked open, the ancient world suddenly came rushing back to life with breathtaking clarity, allowing the temples, the tombs, and the fragile scrolls to speak directly to humanity once more. It was a reminder that even when a civilization crumbles and its independent rulers vanish into dust, its truest essence can never be completely destroyed. It simply waits patiently beneath the sand, ready to whisper its eternal stories to anyone who takes the time to listen. Now, let the grand march of history, from the gold-laden chambers of Tutankhamun to the final, defiant reign of Cleopatra, slowly dissolve into the deep, welcoming stillness of your mind. The immense sandstone cliffs of the Western Valley, which have held the golden treasures and sacred spells of forgotten kings for thousands of years, are now blanketed by the profound, comforting dark of the night. The fierce political struggles, the sweeping conquests, and the brilliant architectural triumphs have all served their purpose, fading away like ancient ink drying upon a fragile scroll. You are completely safe and secure in the peaceful quiet of this present hour, resting comfortably while the timeless spirit of the ancient land wraps around your consciousness like a soft, protective embrace. There are no more empires to defend tonight, no more hidden tombs to uncover, and no more ancient scripts to decode. Allow your breathing to remain slow, deep, and rhythmic, carrying you further down the peaceful river of sleep, drifting effortlessly beneath the very same stars that once guided the hands of the pharaohs. Close your eyes completely, release the very last of your earthly thoughts, and surrender to a deep, restorative slumber. As those unlocked voices rise from the cracked silence of the granite slab, they carry our minds back to the grand architecture of the temples that still stand across the desert landscape, allowing us to truly comprehend the sacred blueprints written into the stone. These monumental complexes were not built as ordinary gathering places or houses of prayer for the general public. They were designed and constructed as literal, physical models of the cosmos at the very moment of creation. The massive outer walls, built from heavy stone blocks, represented the outermost edges of the known universe, acting as a powerful shield against the chaotic forces that lurked in the dark wilderness beyond the kingdom. To step across the grand threshold of a temple was to leave the mundane world behind and enter a realm where every corridor, courtyard, and column whispered a story of divine order. As you visualize walking through these timeless halls in the quiet sanctuary of your mind, look upward at the vast ceilings stretching high above the stone floors. The architects painted these roofs a deep, infinite blue, completely dotting the surface with thousands of brilliant white stars, so that the ceiling perfectly mirrored the night sky, making anyone who walked beneath it feel as though they were standing directly under the eternal heavens. Supporting this massive celestial canopy were rows of colossal stone columns, carved with meticulous care to resemble giant stalks of papyrus, lotus flowers, and palm trees rising from the earth. Walking through these hypostyle halls felt like wandering through a frozen, sacred forest of stone blooming from the primeval marsh, an architectural tribute to the life-giving forces that kept the world in perfect harmony. The design of the temple was intentional in its movement, slowly drawing the observer away from the light of the outer courtyards and guiding them deeper into a world of shadow and silence. As one moved further along the central axis, the stone floors gently sloped upward while the ceilings gradually sloped downward, narrowing the physical space and intensifying the absolute stillness until reaching the absolute heart of the structure, the inner sanctuary. In this small, completely dark chamber, hidden away from the eyes of the ordinary populace who were only permitted into the outer courtyards during grand festivals, sat the sacred statue of the deity. This statue was not regarded as a mere piece of decorative art or a simple representation. Through sacred rituals, it became a living vessel meant to house the actual spiritual essence and presence of the god on earth. Within the absolute quiet of this inner sanctum, the high priests operated as the caretakers of the divine, performing a strict cycle of daily rituals to maintain the cosmic balance. Every morning, the high priest would break the clay seal of the sanctuary doors, lighting sweet frankincense and myrrh to invite the god's presence into the room. The sacred statue was carefully washed with pure water, dressed in the finest layers of colorful linen, anointed with rare, precious oils, and presented with beautiful offerings of fresh bread, fruit, wine, and woven garlands of flowers. The ancient builders engineered these structures with such breathtaking astronomical precision that on one specific, sacred day each year, the alignment of the cosmos would manifest in a spectacular display of light. The rising sun would pierce directly through the grand entrance, sending a single, brilliant beam of golden light traveling all the way down the long, dark corridors to illuminate the hidden statue in the back of the mountain, momentarily awakening the stone with the radiant energy of the heavens. As the blinding beam of morning light slowly recedes from the inner sanctuary, it washes back over the grand stone halls, drawing our eyes to the monumental thresholds where the divine world meets the earthly realm. Standing as eternal watchers at the very gates of these complexes are the colossal statues, towering figures of stone that command the desert horizon and define the sheer scale of ancient ambition. These monumental figures were not built merely to impress the mortal eye or to serve as static decorations for the temple architecture. To the ancient mind, a colossus was a living, breathing sentinel, a sacred vessel meant to contain the actual divine presence on earth. A statue of a pharaoh did not simply show his physical image to the world. It became an active dwelling place for his ka, his immortal spiritual essence, through the sacred and profound ritual known as the opening of the mouth. The cold, unyielding stone was mystically awakened, granting the monument the spiritual senses required to interact with the world of the living. Incense swirled around their massive feet, chants rose in rhythmic cadences through the air, and the spirit of the deity was invited to inhabit the stone, transforming the monument into an active listener positioned between humanity and the gods. From that moment on, the statue saw through its serene stone eyes, heard the silent secrets whispered by pilgrims at its base, and accepted the eternal tribute offered to it. Even long after a king had departed his earthly body and vanished into the shadows of history, his colossal likeness remained awake, silent, seated, and immensely powerful, ensuring that his protective aura would continue to shield the valley across the passing of the ages. These giant guardians flanked the majestic temple thrones and lined the grand processional avenues, creating a landscape that felt entirely charged with sacred energy. Imagine walking along an avenue lined with these massive stone figures, where the repetitive rhythm of their silent, watchful forms creates a pathway of absolute reverence stretching across the sand. They stood as unmoving barriers against the chaotic forces of the outside wilderness, anchoring the cosmic order of Maat firmly to the earth. The creation and transportation of these colossal sentinels represent a triumph of human willpower and mathematical planning that mirrors the construction of the pyramids themselves. Artisans and stonemasons would spend months in the remote quarries, carefully carving a single, massive block of solid rock into a perfectly proportioned deity. Once the form was freed from the mountain, it had to be transported over miles of unforgiving desert terrain and navigated across the waters of the Nile to reach its final sacred destination. This monumental effort was a national project, a collective act of devotion where thousands of skilled workers moved in perfect coordination, driven by the shared belief that they were anchoring the eternal skin of the gods into the very soil of their homeland. To stand in the shadow of these giants was to feel the deep intention of a civilization that refused to let its memory be eroded by time, creating a physical bridge between the temporary life of mortals and the changeless realm of eternity. This grand devotion to shaping the landscape and anchoring the divine into stone did not always yield immediate perfection, for the path to architectural immortality was paved with magnificent trials, unexpected catastrophes, and the profound lessons of human resilience. Long before the Giza Plateau held its flawless coordinates beneath the heavens, earlier generations of master builders wrestled intensely with the unforgiving laws of physics and the raw limitations of their engineering materials. They dared to dream on a scale never before imagined by humanity, and in their daring, they sometimes stumbled spectacularly under the weight of their own monumental ambitions. Visualize the lonely desert site of Medum, where an early, highly ambitious attempt to transition away from traditional step pyramids to a true, smooth-sided structure resulted in a profound structural disaster. Known to history as the Maiden Pyramid, its massive outer casing layers eventually sheared away and collapsed entirely, leaving behind a strange, dramatic stepped tower rising awkwardly from an ocean of its own shattered limestone debris. Yet, the true genius of the ancient architects lay in their absolute refusal to let a catastrophic failure halt their march toward eternity. Instead of abandoning the pursuit of the skies in fear or shame, the royal builders carefully studied the ruin, adapting their understanding of gravity, angle, and foundational shifting to adjust their grand designs. A short distance away at Dahshur, the famous bent pyramid stands as a brilliant, highly visible monument to a mid-construction crisis where the heavy internal stones began to crack and shift dangerously under their own immense pressure. Recognizing that the structure was on the verge of another devastating collapse, the engineers made an abrupt, brilliant decision to alter the slope of the pyramid halfway up, changing the angle from a steep 54 degrees to a much safer, gentler 43 degrees. These unique monuments remind us that the timeless majesty of Egypt was not born flawless or effortless. It was forged through real human risk, technical failure, and an unshakable desire to reach the sky that simply adapted, rebuilt, and triumphed right over the broken mistakes of the past. As we contemplate the incredible determination of those early architects who rebuilt and adapted their grand designs right over the broken stones of their failures, we begin to realize that these vast monuments are not merely cold, empty mountains of rock. They are deeply personal archives of human existence, preserving the intimate whispers of the ordinary people who labored in their shadows. When you step inside the dimly lit, labyrinthine corridors of a finished royal tomb or wander through the monumental hypostyle halls of a temple, your eyes are naturally drawn to the formal, majestic hieroglyphs proclaiming the eternal triumph of pharaohs and gods. Yet, if you look closer, past the official artwork and tucked into the hidden corners, the rough stone surfaces reveal something entirely unexpected. A vast collection of ancient graffiti left behind by real, everyday individuals thousands of years ago. These were not acts of modern vandalism, but profound declarations of presence, carved or scrawled in ink by weary workers, pious pilgrims, and even playful pranksters who found themselves standing before the majesty of eternity. In one quiet chamber, a scribe from a long-forgotten dynasty brushed a line of casual text, simply stating that he had arrived with his closest friend to marvel at the works of the ancestors. In another hidden niche, a rough hand hastily etched the beloved name of a faithful dog into the living limestone. Some of these informal markings are deeply teasing, humorous, or even subtly rebellious, peeling back the heavy, serious layers of religious ritual to expose the warm, beating heart of a people who laughed, complained, and sought to leave their own tiny, indelible mark upon a world dominated by giants. Across the immense gulf of millennia, these rough-hewn scribbles still echo with an astonishingly familiar clarity, reminding us that beneath the golden crowns and behind the sacred temple veils, Egypt was a living, breathing landscape populated by individuals who simply wanted to be remembered by the passing ages. This deep-seated human anxiety about being forgotten and the intense desire to protect the sacred spaces of the dead from the intrusion of chaotic forces eventually manifested in a much darker and highly strategic form of writing, carved directly onto the heavy stone thresholds of the tombs, because tomb robbing was an immediate, terrifying reality that threatened to disrupt the eternal peace of the deceased. The master builders did not rely solely on hidden doors, massive granite portcullises, and labyrinthine, false passages to secure the royal resting places. They unleashed the power of language itself as a defensive weapon, inscribing dire, bone-chilling curses meant to terrify and paralyze any intruder who dared to cross the sacred threshold with malice in their heart. Visualize a bold thief slipping through the midnight shadows of the valley, their torchlight flickering against the cold stone entry, only to encounter a wall of text that directly warns, "Cursed be he who disturbs this tomb, for may his earthly limbs tremble in agony, his worldly plans crumble into ash, and his immortal soul never find rest among the stars." These inscriptions were formal invocations of cosmic wrath, calling down the terrifying judgment of the gods, the slow torment of plagues, or the relentless vengeance of protective spirits upon anyone who violated the absolute silence of the sepulchre. Whether these ancient curses possessed genuine magical power remains a question of beautiful mystery, but their psychological impact on the human mind across the centuries was undeniably absolute. Even deep into the modern era, when archaeologists carefully broke the ancient clay seals of long-lost chambers, stories of mysterious coincidences, sudden illnesses, and haunting misfortunes continued to linger in the air, proving that a few well-placed words carved into the dark stone thousands of years ago could still make the boldest hearts hesitate, wondering what silent, sleepless forces might still be watching from the deep shadows of the earth. As these silent, sleepless forces stand their eternal watch over the dark thresholds of the tombs, the protective magic of the ancient world reveals itself not only in the hidden shadows of the dead, but in the roaring, highly visible iconography worn proudly by the living pharaoh upon his very brow. The elaborate crowns of Egypt were far more than magnificent symbols of royal authority or mere indicators of political supremacy. They were active, living invocations of divine protection designed to shield the ruler as he maintained the delicate balance of the earth. Coiled tightly at the very front of the pharaoh's headdress, poised and symbols of terrifying alertness, were two sacred creatures, a cobra and a vulture. The cobra, known to the ancient world as the Uraeus, represented the fierce goddess Wadjet, the divine guardian who watched over the sprawling, fertile plains of Lower Egypt. Beside her sat the vulture, representing the goddess Nekbit, the protective and majestic deity who soared over the rugged mountains of Upper Egypt. Together, these two creatures fused the earthly geography of a united kingdom into a singular, undeniable statement of cosmic rule on the king's forehead. Yet, these were never treated as passive ornaments of state. They were feared as magical sentinels, capable of unleashing supernatural wrath upon the enemies of order. Ancient myths whispered that the coiled cobra on the brow was magically alive, ready to spit literal blinding fire at any adversary who dared approach the king with malice, while the vulture spread her vast, invisible wings to shelter his royal steps from harm. Every time the pharaoh donned his sacred crown, he ceased to walk merely as an ordinary mortal. He stepped forward as a divine warrior, carrying the terrifying weapons and protective presence of the gods directly upon his brow, ensuring that order would always triumph over chaos. To sustain this breathtaking grandeur, and to provide the immense wealth required to build shimmering monuments, the pharaohs commanded vast, perilous expeditions far beyond the fertile green ribbon of the Nile, deep into the scorching, sun-baked mountains of the eastern desert. This was a desolate realm of heat and stone, far removed from the comforting waters of the river, where Egypt's most sacred treasure was born, pure, radiant gold. To the ancient mind, gold was never viewed as a simple currency or a metric of worldly commercial wealth. It was revered with absolute devotion as the literal, incorruptible flesh of the gods themselves, because it never tarnished, never decayed, and never lost its brilliant, sun-like luster. It represented the very essence of eternity, a physical fragment of celestial light trapped forever within the heavy rock of the earth. The mines were carved deep into the unforgiving mountainsides under a blazing, merciless sun, worked by laborers who navigated an environment defined by extreme physical hardship and spiritual danger. Ancient inscriptions record that these remote desert routes were heavily guarded not just by physical garrisons, but by powerful sacred texts and protective spells designed to ward off the chaotic, dangerous spirits that roamed the wild wastes. To extract the glittering metal from the deep rock was to walk a razor-thin edge between immense fortune and sacred risk, a holy labor that transformed the hidden treasures of the dark desert into the shimmering skin of the pharaohs, ensuring that the majesty of the kingdom would gleam undiminished across the passing of countless ages. Let the blinding radiance of this divine gold and the fierce protection of the royal cobra slowly soften within your awareness, transitioning into a gentle, soothing warmth that envelops your resting body. The golden crowns have been safely laid aside in their quiet, dark chambers, and the burning desert mines have grown perfectly cold and silent beneath the vast expanse of the night sky. The unblinking eyes of the urious and the spreading wings of the vulture have shifted from symbols of royal wrath into soft, cosmic guardians watching over your peaceful rest. You are entirely safe, completely cradled by the deep, unyielding stability of a history that knew how to protect what was sacred. Allow your breath to flow like a slow, rhythmic breeze over the desert sands, releasing the very last remnants of the modern day as you sink deeper and deeper into a profound, restorative sleep beneath the eternal turning of the stars. Close your eyes fully, trust the timeless quiet of the valley, and sleep. Sleep deeply. This pursuit of divine gold deep within the scorching mountains brings our focus back to the very nature of the soil that defined the entire Egyptian universe, a dual landscape where the physical environment itself was treated as a profound spiritual map. To the ancient mind, the world was split into two fiercely opposing yet beautifully balanced forces, visible to anyone who stood at the edge of the valley and looked out toward the horizon. There was the Black Land, known in their ancient tongue as Kemet, the narrow, incredibly fertile ribbon of dark earth packed closely along the banks of the Nile. This black soil, enriched every single year by the life-giving silt of the river's flood, was the vibrant heart of civilization, a place of blooming crops, rushing irrigation canals, busy marketplaces, and the warm laughter of daily human life. But immediately beyond this green paradise, rising sharply like an unyielding wall of heat, lay the Red Land, or Dahshur, the infinite, unforgiving expanse of burning sun, jagged rock, and dry, shifting sand dunes. The Red Land was not merely seen as a geographic wasteland. It was feared and revered as the absolute domain of Set, the powerful god of disorder, fierce desert storms, and unpredictable chaos. Yet, the ancient people understood that the very existence of Egypt depended entirely upon the perpetual cosmic tension between these two rival worlds, a delicate equilibrium where life could only flourish because order held its ground against the surrounding wilderness. It was precisely along this razor-thin border, right where the rich black mud of the valley met the dry crimson sands of the desert, that the architects chose to erect their most magnificent monuments of stone. They did not build their massive pyramids, colossal statues, and heavy temple pylons deep within the soft, damp agricultural fields where the annual floods might undermine their foundations over time. Instead, they pushed their architectural ambitions right to the edge of the Red Land, planting the immense weight of their stone structures firmly into the dry, preserving bedrock of the desert plateau. By placing these monuments on the geometric threshold between Kemet and Dahshur, the pharaohs were making a powerful, unyielding statement to the cosmos. The towering stone walls and shimmering white pyramids functioned as magnificent spiritual bastions, physical anchors of Mad that stood as an eternal line of defense, keeping the chaotic forces of the desert from swallowing the fragile green valley of life. To look out from the river and see a line of stone monuments rising proudly against the barren desert backdrop was to receive a comforting, visual guarantee that the gods were actively guarding the kingdom, ensuring that the light of order would never be overwhelmed by the dark, encroaching sands of chaos. As these monumental stone anchors held the eternal line against the encroaching crimson sands, they welcomed the weary traveler toward the grandest architectural thresholds ever conceived by human hands, the massive temple pylons. To approach an ancient Egyptian temple was to confront a pair of colossal, tapering stone towers flanking a central gateway, rising like artificial mountains directly out of the flat desert horizon. These structures were not merely grand entryways. They were literal, physical manifestations of the sacred hieroglyph Akhit, which represented the cosmic horizon, where the sun god Ra was born anew each morning between two primeval peaks. By carving these mountain-like gateways into the landscape, the pharaohs permanently captured the sunrise within their architecture, ensuring that every dawn would be framed by the unyielding geometry of their rule. The temple itself was viewed as a complete cosmic model, its massive outer walls symbolizing the very edges of the physical world, creating a safe enclosure where order reigned absolute. To step through the monumental gateway of the pylon was to transition from the chaotic wilderness into a space meticulously designed for the gods themselves. Before these immense stone facades stood towering flagstaffs cut from the finest, aromatic cedar of Lebanon, their tips encased in glistening electrum that caught the moving shadows of the wind, flying grand banners that announced to the heavens that this was a place where divinity resided on earth. The sheer physical scale of these pylons was a testament to the absolute command the pharaoh held over the material world. Massive reliefs were carved deep into the sandstone faces, depicting the king standing in gigantic proportions, triumphing over the enemies of the state and offering the fruits of victory to the gods. These carvings were deeply filled with rich, vibrant pigments, brilliant reds, deep blues, and radiant golds that gleamed brilliantly beneath the intense desert sun, transforming the temple entrance into a living canvas of cosmic triumph. As the day faded and the twilight took hold, the massive cedar doors, sheeted in bronze and gold, would turn slowly on their heavy stone pivots, closing out the mundane world and locking in the absolute silence of the inner sanctuaries. To look upon a temple pylon in the gathering dark was to realize that humanity had successfully constructed a gateway to the infinite, a permanent sanctuary where the fragile breath of mortal life was safely sheltered behind walls of unbreakable rock. Beyond the heavy, closed doors of the monumental pylon, the architecture immediately opens up into the grand, sun-drenched space of the outer peristyle courtyard. This expansive court served as the primary gathering area where the earthly world was allowed to briefly mingle with the fringes of divine majesty during the grand festival processions. Surrounding the perimeter of this vast space are deep colonnades, their shadows offering a cool reprieve from the intense glare of the desert sky. It is here that the true, staggering scale of an ancient sanctuary like Karnak begins to reveal itself to the patient observer. Karnak was not simply a single building constructed by a single monarch. It was a sprawling, living city of the gods that grew continuously for more than 2,000 years. Generation after generation, almost every major pharaoh who ascended the throne of Egypt felt a deep, inescapable spiritual obligation to leave their own unique imprint upon this most sacred ground. They added new courtyards, raised towering obelisks, constructed small hidden chapels, and expanded the thick mud brick walls, creating a magnificent architectural tapestry where different centuries and distinct artistic styles collapsed into a singular, overwhelming statement of eternal devotion. Stepping past this sunlit courtyard, the traveler transitions into what is arguably the most breathtaking architectural achievement of the ancient world, the great Hypostyle hall. To walk into this space is to leave the open sky behind and enter a dense, labyrinthine forest composed entirely of colossal stone. 134 massive sandstone columns rise in 16 majestic rows, towering over anyone who walks among them with an unyielding, silent gravity. The 12 central columns are so incredibly immense that it takes several grown adults joining hands just to encircle the base of a single one. They soar over 70 feet into the air, capped with magnificent open lotus blossoms that seem to expand outward to touch the very ceiling. The remaining 122 columns, standing subtly lower on either side, feature capitals carved in the likeness of closed lotus buds, perfectly mimicking the natural life cycle of the sacred river flora. The ancient artisans covered every single square inch of these towering shafts with deeply incised relief carvings, detailing the complex mythology of the cosmos and the eternal triumphs of the warrior kings. The true genius of this space, however, lies in how the architects masterfully manipulated the natural elements of light and shadow to create a deeply spiritual atmosphere. Because the central rows of columns rose significantly higher than the flanking sections, the engineers were able to construct massive clerestory windows high up in the stone roof walls. These windows were not open gaps, but beautifully pierced stone grills that filtered the blinding daytime sun into thin, dramatic shafts of golden light. These concentrated beams cut through the cool, dark interior of the hall, slicing through the perpetual haze of burning frankincense and myrrh. The light did not illuminate the entire space. Instead, it moved slowly across the carved surfaces as the sun traveled across the sky, momentarily bringing specific images of gods and pharaohs to life, while leaving the rest of the colossal forest shrouded in a mysterious, velvety twilight. It was an intentional architectural theater, a physical manifestation of the primeval moment of creation when the first mound of earth rose from the dark, chaotic waters of the void and caught the very first rays of the cosmic sun. Connecting this gargantuan house of Amun-Ra to its sister sanctuary, the Temple of Luxor, is another monumental wonder that stretched across the landscape like a grand, triumphal ribbon. The Avenue of Sphinxes, stretching for nearly 2 miles through the heart of the ancient capital, this sacred pathway was flanked on either side by hundreds of meticulously carved stone sphinxes, each possessing the body of a powerful lion and the head of either a human pharaoh or a sacred ram. During the grand Opet festival, when the statues of the divine family were carried out from their dark sanctuaries and placed upon magnificent golden river barges, this avenue became the focal point of the entire kingdom's spiritual energy. Thousands of citizens, musicians, dancers, and priests would line the stone path, their voices rising in a rhythmic chorus that echoed off the temple walls, while the stone sphinxes stood in absolute, unmoving alignment, guarding the sacred procession as it moved between the great seats of power, weaving the mortal city and the divine realm into a singular, grand reality that defied the passage of time. The magnificent spectacle of the Opet festival, with its shimmering golden barges carrying the divine images along the river, was only made possible by a vast, invisible network of logistical genius that stretched hundreds of miles away from the capital city. The lifeblood of all this architectural grandeur lay deep within the earth, specifically in the monumental quarry sites where the very bones of the kingdom were unearthed. To build the soaring walls of the great Hypostyle hall and the towering pylons of Luxor, the pharaohs turned their gaze southward to the rugged sandstone canyons of Jebel el-Silsila. This dramatic location, where the Nile narrows sharply between sheer cliffs of solid rock, served as the ultimate birthplace of Egyptian temple architecture. For generations, thousands of stonemasons, engineers, and overseers populated these remote outposts, transforming the wild rock faces into highly organized, multi-tiered networks of open-air mines. Walking through Jebel el-Silsila was like walking through a city carved in reverse. Massive staircases of stone descended into the ground, and perfectly flat vertical walls bore the carved marks of ancient chisels, alongside official royal inscriptions boasting of the millions of blocks extracted for the glory of the gods. The extraction of these gargantuan sandstone blocks required a profound understanding of geology and a masterful deployment of simple, natural forces. Master craftsmen would examine the rock faces for natural faults, utilizing heavy bronze chisels and hard dolerite pounding stones to carve deep, precise channels around a desired block. To detach a massive multi-ton stone from the bedrock without fracturing its core, the workers employed a brilliant technique involving dry wooden wedges. They would hammer these tightly into the carved channels and repeatedly drench them with river water. As the wood absorbed the moisture, it expanded with an immense, slow hydraulic pressure that naturally cracked the stone cleanly away from the cliff face. Once freed, these rough blocks were meticulously trimmed down by specialized sculptors using copper tools and smoothing stones, ensuring their dimensions matched the strict mathematical blueprints provided by the royal architects. Moving these immense objects across the rugged terrain to the riverbanks required the coordination of hundreds of laborers pulling in perfect unison on thick ropes of woven papyrus, guiding the heavy wooden sledges over tracks lubricated with water and slick river mud. The ultimate phase of this monumental journey relied entirely on the rhythmic coming of the annual Nile inundation, a season when the rising river transformed from a peaceful stream into a vast, deep highway capable of carrying the heaviest burdens on earth. Massive cargo barges, constructed from sturdy logs of Lebanese cedar and local acacia wood, were brought into specialized dry docks carved next to the quarries. As the floodwaters spilled over the banks and filled these channels, the gargantuan ships were lifted into the current, loaded with sandstone blocks and granite columns that weighed hundreds of tons. Navigating these heavily laden vessels down the river required an extraordinary display of seamanship. Fleets of smaller rowing boats would guide the main barges, utilizing the powerful northward current while struggling against the unpredictable winds of the valley. The royal administration engineered dedicated canals that cut directly from the main river channel straight to the construction sites of Karnak and Luxor, allowing these floating mountains of stone to bypass the crowded city streets and arrive directly at the temple gates, where massive earth and sand ramps awaited to hoist them into the sky, continuing the eternal cycle of building a world meant to outlast time itself. As these massive earth and sand ramps slowly climbed the outer faces of the rising temple walls, allowing the multi-ton blocks to slide into their precise resting places, the true limit of Egyptian architectural ambition was not found within the completed sanctuaries, but rather far to the south, resting silently in the ancient red granite quarries of Aswan. Here lies a colossal ghost of engineering, a monumental testament to a dream that proved too vast even for the master builders of the New Kingdom. Known to the modern world as the unfinished Obelisk, this gargantuan sliver of solid stone sits frozen in time, still intimately fused to the living bedrock from which it was being meticulously carved. Ordered by Queen Hatshepsut to surpass every monument that had ever come before, this single shaft of granite was designed to soar nearly 140 feet into the sky and weigh an astronomical 1,200 tons, a mass greater than almost any single stone ever moved by human hands in antiquity. Day after day, crews of specialized quarrymen stood in the trench surrounding the stone, rhythmically pounding the unyielding granite with heavy balls of greenish dolerite, slowly chipping away the rock inch by tedious inch. But just as the monumental shaft was nearing its final liberation from the mountain, a sudden, devastating crack ripped through the heart of the stone. The microscopic fracture shattered months of agonizing human labor in an instant, rendering the giant useless for its cosmic purpose. Yet, rather than blasting the ruined stone away, the architects simply walked away, leaving it perfectly preserved in its cradle of bedrock, creating a spectacular open-air blueprint that reveals across thousands of years the raw, unfiltered methodology of pharaonic engineering. While this cracked giant remained anchored forever to its southern quarry, other monumental experiments successfully made their way down the river, settling as towering, independent sentinels on the western plains of Thebes. Rising majestically from the fertile floodplains like ancient stone cliffs are the colossi of Memnon, two gargantuan twin statues depicting Pharaoh Amenhotep III in a state of eternal, seated meditation. Carved from massive blocks of quartzite sandstone, dragged over 400 miles overland from the northern quarries near modern Cairo. These 60-foot-tall giants originally stood as the grand guardians at the gateway of Amenhotep's mortuary temple, a complex so vast and magnificent that it easily eclipsed even the grand temple of Karnak in its day. Over the centuries, the annual floods of the Nile slowly dissolved the fragile mud-brick enclosures of the surrounding sanctuaries, leaving the temple to vanish entirely into the rich agricultural soil. Yet the two stone colossi refused to break, standing entirely alone in the open fields as the sole survivors of an obliterated paradise. Following a violent earthquake in the early Roman era that severely shattered the upper half of the northern Colossus, a bizarre and beautiful phenomenon transformed these ancient guardians into a global wonder for travelers of the classical world. Every morning, just as the first rays of the dawn sun struck the weathered, porous stone, the sudden thermal expansion of the morning air passing through the fractures created an eerie metallic sound that echoed softly across the quiet plains. To the visiting Greeks and Romans, who renamed the monuments after their legendary hero Memnon, the statue was magically alive, singing a mournful greeting to his mother, the goddess of the dawn. Emperors, poets, and soldiers made long, arduous pilgrimages across the Mediterranean just to sit in the cool twilight at the base of the giant, waiting in absolute, breathless silence for the first light of day to break over the eastern mountains, listening for that fleeting, otherworldly whisper of the stone, a beautiful testament to how the monumental structures of the pharaohs continued to capture the imagination of humanity, transforming the cold architecture of royal ego into an eternal living legend that blurred the line between the earth and the heavens. This haunting morning song of the shattered colossus brings our journey to the final, grand mystery of the pharaonic architecture, the monumental pylons and hidden structures that lay buried even further north, where the Nile Delta opens its wide arms into the Mediterranean Sea. Among these great monuments of the final dynasties, none were more strategically vital or structurally complex than the great fortresses and temples built along the eastern frontiers. These massive frontier stations were engineered not only to honor the gods, but to act as unyielding shields against the rising empires of the east. The walls of these fortresses were constructed of sun-dried mud brick, but their cores were reinforced with massive timber beams and thick layers of river reed mats, creating a flexible, shock-absorbent framework that could withstand the relentless pounding of enemy battering rams. The pharaohs designed these garrisons to be entirely self-sustaining, carving enormous subterranean granaries and deep stone-lined wells directly into the desert bedrock, ensuring that a small, dedicated force could hold the line for months against a massive besieging army, protecting the rich green valley from the chaotic forces of the outside world. Yet, as the physical strength of these mud brick fortresses eventually eroded under the slow pressure of the centuries, the rulers of the final dynasties turned their architectural genius toward creating monuments that were entirely invulnerable to both human warfare and natural decay. In the sacred northern city of Tanis, the pharaohs of the 21st and 22nd dynasties achieved a stunning architectural revolution by constructing a massive sacred precinct composed almost entirely of reused stone blocks from earlier glorious eras. They dismantled the monumental structures of Rameses, the Great, from the nearby abandoned capital of Pi-Rameses, moving thousands of beautifully carved blocks, colossal granite statues, and towering obelisks to build a completely new city of the gods. To walk through Tanis was to see a magnificent, living collage of history. A single temple wall might feature a blocks carved during the Old Kingdom, resting perfectly beside a relief from the height of the New Kingdom, all bound together by the unyielding spiritual intent of a later age. This practice was not viewed as simple looting or a lack of resources. It was a profound act of spiritual inheritance, a deliberate merging of the ancestors' magic with the survival of the current realm, ensuring that the ancient, accumulated power of the pharaohs would remain firmly anchored to the soil. The ultimate manifestation of this architectural durability was found within the royal tombs hidden deep inside this northern temple precinct. Fearing the widespread tomb robbing that had devastated the Valley of the Kings in the south, the pharaohs of Tanis built their final resting places not in isolated desert canyons, but directly underneath the heavy stone floors of the great temple courtyards. These tombs were compact, subterranean bunkers constructed entirely of massive, interlocking blocks of solid granite and limestone. Above them, day after day, the priests performed the sacred daily rituals, walked in long processional lines, and burned sweet incense, entirely unaware that the physical remains of their kings were resting in absolute silence directly beneath their feet. This strategic shift represented the absolute perfection of pharaonic secrecy. The kings had successfully transformed the most public and heavily guarded spaces of the living into the most secure and hidden sanctuaries for the dead, wrapping their eternity in the dual protection of military might and divine worship, an unyielding statement of survival that would remain completely undisturbed for thousands of years, until the modern world finally lifted the stone floors to find the silver sarcophagi and golden masks of the northern pharaohs gleaming in the dark. The gleaming silver sarcophagi and exquisite golden masks discovered beneath the stone floors of Tanis reveal a profound truth about the pharaonic mindset, that the ultimate goal of all monumental architecture was the perfect, permanent encapsulation of a sacred spark. This identical obsession with layering protection around the royal body guides our consciousness away from the shifting marshes of the delta and pulls it back across the vast canvas of time, returning directly to the absolute peak of structural secrecy hidden deep within the limestone heart of the Great Pyramid of Giza. While later generations sought safety by carving labyrinthine tunnels deep into the hidden faces of desert cliffs, the Old Kingdom masters achieved the impossible by building a man-made mountain of stone entirely around a complex, multi-tiered network of hidden chambers and ascending passageways. To understand the true grandeur of this monument, one must look past its blinding white outer casing and venture into the silent, oppressive dark of its interior, where the laws of engineering were pushed to their absolute limits to create an unyielding fortress for an eternal soul. The journey into this mountain of rock begins at a narrow opening on the northern face, leading into a steep, descending corridor that drops sharply into the darkness, pointing directly toward a mysterious, unfinished chamber carved deep into the bedrock far beneath the pyramid's base. But the true architectural marvel lies in the ascending passage that branches upward, forcing the traveler to move against the relentless pull of gravity into the Grand Gallery. To walk through the Grand Gallery is to experience a space that feels entirely otherworldly, a soaring, corbelled hallway that climbs dramatically into the heart of the monument. The walls are constructed from massive blocks of perfectly polished limestone, layered meticulously so that each tier projects slightly inward over the one below it, creating a magnificent, vaulted canopy that rises nearly 30 feet above the stone floor. The craftsmanship is so blindingly precise that the joints between these multi-ton blocks are virtually invisible, fitted together so tightly that not even a modern razor blade can be slipped between the stone seams, an astonishing demonstration of ancient geometry executed in total darkness by the flickering light of simple oil lamps. At the absolute peak of this breathtaking ascent, past a series of massive granite portcullis blocks designed to slide down heavy stone grooves and seal the passage forever against future intruders, lies the king's chamber. This austere, windowless room stands in stark contrast to the highly decorated temples of the later empires. It features no colorful paintings, no carved hieroglyphs, and no elaborate reliefs, consisting entirely of smooth, monumental blocks of dark red granite hauled hundreds of miles down the river from the quarries of Aswan. Sitting quietly at the far end of this silent vault is the monolithic granite sarcophagus, hollowed out from a single, massive piece of rock using heavy bronze saws and abrasive quartz sand. The engineers scaled this stone container so perfectly that it is actually a fraction of an inch wider than the narrow entrance corridor, meaning it could never have been brought into the room after the pyramid was finished. The entire monumental mountain was literally constructed around this single stone chest, anchoring it to the center of the universe before the massive roof was sealed. The true structural genius of the king's chamber, however, remains completely hidden from view, resting directly above the flat granite ceiling where it battles the unimaginable forces of gravity day after day, millennium after millennium. Recognizing that the immense weight of millions of tons of limestone pressing down from the upper half of the pyramid would instantly crush the hollow chamber below, the royal architects engineered a spectacular network of 5 stress-relieving chambers stacked directly on top of each other. Each layer consists of massive granite beams spanning the width of the room, separated by narrow pockets of empty space, while the final layer is capped by a massive, pointed roof made of giant limestone blocks angled outward like a tent. This brilliant design successfully diverts the crushing weight of the pyramid away from the king's chamber, pushing the immense pressure down into the solid core of the monument and ensuring that the internal vault remains perfectly intact, a silent and indestructible pocket of peace buried deep within a mountain of stone, waiting out the centuries in absolute, unchanging equilibrium. This absolute, unchanging equilibrium within the mountain of rock was not entirely isolated from the outside universe, for even within the pitch-black silence of the king's chamber, the architects left behind a pair of mysterious, narrow shafts that pierced directly through the massive body of the pyramid, linking the deep burial vault straight to the infinite starry sky outside. These shafts, often mistakenly referred to as mere air vents by early explorers, were engineered with a precise, unwavering trajectory that cuts through dozens of layers of heavy limestone blocks, angling upward at perfect geometric inclinations until they break through the outer surface of the monument. Modern astronomical calculations have revealed that thousands of years ago, when the pyramid was newly completed, these narrow stone corridors pointed directly like cosmic telescopes toward specific, highly sacred regions of the night sky. The northern shaft was aligned perfectly with the circumpolar stars, the eternal celestial guardians that never set beneath the horizon, known to the ancient astronomers as the imperishable ones, because they never experienced the symbolic death of disappearing from view. The southern shaft pointed with equal precision toward the belt of Orion, the constellation closely identified with Osiris, the mighty lord of rebirth and the afterlife. This design meant that the king's chamber was never truly a dead end. It functioned as a magnificent spiritual launchpad, a physical and symbolic conduit engineered to guide the pharaoh's liberated souls straight through the heavy core of the monument and shoot it directly into the heart of the cosmos, allowing the dead monarch to take his rightful place among the eternal, unsetting stars that govern the universe. Stepping back out through these celestial pathways to the blinding light at the base of the monumental structure, the landscape reveals that the pyramid was never a lonely, isolated tower standing entirely alone in the desert sand, but rather the beating heart of a vast, hyper-organized city of eternity. Hugging the eastern and southern faces of Khufu's monument are massive, subterranean boat pits carved directly into the solid limestone bedrock, sealed away beneath gargantuan stone slabs that weighed many tons. For millennia, These pits kept one of the grandest secrets of ancient maritime engineering perfectly safe from the destructive forces of wind and moisture. When archaeologists carefully lifted these heavy covers in the mid-20th century, the dark chambers released a wave of ancient, aromatic cedar scent that had been trapped in the rock for over 4,500 years. Resting quietly in the dark were the disassembled pieces of a magnificent, full-sized royal vessel, its dark wood perfectly preserved and laid out in a meticulous, symbolic order that resembled a giant, prehistoric puzzle waiting to be solved. The reconstruction of this magnificent artifact, globally celebrated as the Khufu solar boat, exposed a level of craftsmanship that completely redefines our understanding of ancient technology. Measuring over 140 feet from its elegant, curved prow to its high stern, this grand ship was constructed entirely without a single metal nail or wooden peg to bind its heavy cedar planks together. Instead, the ancient shipwrights utilized a sophisticated system of thousands of interlocking mortise and tenon joints, weaving the entire wooden hull together with incredibly strong, flexible ropes made from local hafa grass and hemp. When the vessel was placed into the waters of the Nile, the dry wood would naturally expand, pulling the tight ropes into an unbreakable, watertight seal that allowed the heavy ship to navigate the deep currents with absolute stability. This vessel was never meant to carry ordinary cargo or to fish in the river marshes. It was a sacred cosmic voyager, a physical manifestation of the divine barge, utilized by the sun god Ra to travel across the sky during the day and conquer the terrifying shadows of the underworld by night. By burying this magnificent ship directly beside the base of his pyramid, the pharaoh ensured that when he awoke in the afterlife, he would possess the ultimate tool of exploration, a majestic vessel ready to sail across the celestial oceans of the heavens, transforming the heavy architecture of the Giza Plateau into a sprawling, multi-dimensional port of call for an immortal journey. This grand obsession with embedding the tools of cosmic transit directly into the monumental landscape extended to the smaller satellite pyramids that sit quietly in the shadow of the main structure. These smaller, elegant triangles of stone were constructed with the same mathematical devotion to house the mortal remains of Khufu's queens and closest family members, creating a tightly knit royal court of eternity that mirrored the political hierarchy of the living world. Each satellite pyramid possessed its own independent mortuary chapel and miniature offering altars, ensuring that the daily flow of spiritual nourishment would continue to reach every branch of the royal lineage down through the generations. The entire complex was bound together by a massive, elevated stone causeway that stretched for over half a mile across the desert plateau, a monumental covered corridor lined with beautifully carved reliefs that led directly from the high pyramid temples down to the valley temple, situated at the edge of the green fields, creating a permanent, physical highway that seamlessly linked the seasonal life of the river valley with the unchanging, unyielding architecture of the high desert plateau. Descending this monumental stone causeway, the pathway brings our journey directly to the grand threshold of the valley temple, a structure that functioned as the essential physical gateway between the temporary, seasonal world of the river valley and the unchanging, eternal realm of the desert plateau. The Valley Temple of Kaffa stands as an extraordinary masterpiece of austere grandeur, presenting a stark and beautiful contrast to the highly decorated, painted sanctuaries of the later New Kingdom empires. Here, the architects relied entirely on the raw, majestic power of geometric simplicity and the pure, unyielding mass of noble materials to convey a sense of the divine. The interior of this ancient pavilion consists of a magnificent, T-shaped hall defined by colossal, monolithic pillars of deep red Aswan granite, their surfaces polished to a mirror-like smoothness that reflects the soft, shifting light. Resting quietly beneath these towering red columns is a floor composed entirely of massive slabs of pure, translucent white alabaster, which shimmers with a soft, ethereal glow when the brilliant desert sun filters down through narrow, angled slits cut high into the stone walls. The sheer physical scale of the engineering utilized to construct this valley sanctuary pushes our modern comprehension of ancient capability to its absolute breaking point. The walls are built from a core of gargantuan limestone blocks, some of which weigh upwards of 150 tons each, extracted from the deep trenches surrounding the Great Sphinx. To lift these massive megalithic stones to significant heights and fit them together with such astonishing microscopic precision that they form perfectly flush, interlocking corners is an achievement that defies simple explanation. The ancient builders did not utilize mortar to bind these giant stones. Instead, they carved them with complex, multi-sided joints, weaving the monumental architecture together like a giant, prehistoric puzzle that has successfully withstood the tremors of the earth and the erosion of the wind for over 45 centuries. Walking through this silent, granite forest of columns, one feels a profound sense of weight and absolute permanence, a realization that humanity had successfully constructed a fortress capable of sheltering the sacred mysteries of the king from the relentless decay of the material world. Situated immediately adjacent to this granite pavilion, sharing the very same limestone foundation, is the Sphinx Temple, an architectural twin engineered to function in perfect mathematical harmony with the movements of the heavens. Within this sacred precinct, the ancient stargazers and royal architects achieved a spectacular synchronization of space, stone, and time that permanently anchored the cosmic calendar to the Giza Plateau. The temple's central axes and rows of monolithic pillars were aligned with such breathtaking astronomical precision that during the vernal and autumnal equinoxes, a viewer standing within the inner sanctuary would witness a spectacular celestial display. At the exact moment of twilight, the setting sun would descend directly beside the majestic shoulder of the Great Sphinx, casting a long, perfectly straight golden shadow that bisected the temple floor and illuminated the central altar. This intentional alignment transformed the entire monumental landscape into a colossal, living clock, a physical manifestation of cosmic order that visually demonstrated to all who looked upon it that the reign of the pharaoh was perfectly synchronized with the eternal rhythms of the sun god Ra, ensuring that the light of truth would always find its way through the stone structures of the earth. This eternal synchronization of solar light and monumental stone did not remain confined to the northern plateaus of Giza. It traveled deeply up the winding course of the river, evolving across centuries to shape the colossal mortuary complexes of the New Kingdom pharaohs on the western plains of Thebes. Among these magnificent later structures, none achieved a more perfect fusion of sacred architecture and unyielding military might than the grand temple palace of Ramesses Roman III at Medinet Habu. Approaching this sprawling complex, the traditional peaceful atmosphere of a divine sanctuary gives way to an overwhelming sense of an impregnable citadel. The ancient architects surrounded the entire sacred precinct with a pair of massive, concentric enclosure walls built from millions of heavy mud bricks, thick enough for multiple chariots to drive along their summits, creating a permanent fortress capable of sheltering the entire local population during times of civil unrest or foreign incursions. This strategic design demonstrated a profound evolution in the pharaonic mindset, a realization that in an increasingly hostile and changing world, the physical house of the god had to function simultaneously as an indestructible shield for the state. The gateway to this sacred citadel stands as one of the most unique and striking architectural features in all of Egypt, The Grand Migdol Tower, inspired directly by the formidable Asiatic fortresses encountered by the pharaohs during their military campaigns in the Levant. This towering stone gateway features high crenellated battlements, narrow arrow slits, and twin projecting towers that look down upon the approaching visitor with absolute defensive authority. Yet, the interior of this massive stone bastion reveals a surprising and intimate contrast to its fierce exterior. The upper rooms were designed as a private royal retreat, where the pharaoh could rest in the cool evening breeze, surrounded by beautifully carved reliefs depicting the king relaxing in his palace, listening to music, and being presented with flowers by the women of the royal court. This brilliant juxtaposition of military strength and luxurious domestic peace perfectly encapsulated the dual nature of the pharaoh's duty: to stand as an unyielding warrior at the gates of the kingdom while maintaining a serene paradise of order within the borders. Passing through the dark, echoing tunnel of the Migdol Gate, the traveler emerges into the grand first courtyard of the temple, where the sandstone walls preserve some of the most dramatic and historically vital narrative reliefs ever carved by human hands. Here, the artists documented with staggering, graphic detail the desperate clash between Egypt and the mysterious, migrating coalitions known as the Sea Peoples, whose massive fleets had completely dismantled the great empires of the Mediterranean. The carvings wrap around the massive pylons like an ancient, stone-etched tapestry, depicting chaotic naval battles where Egyptian archers rain down arrows upon foreign ships, turning the river into a churning mass of capsized vessels and fallen invaders. The sculptors carved these figures with such extraordinary depth and precision that the distinct feathered headdresses, unique shields, and frantic expressions of the foreign warriors are perfectly legible across 3 millennia. It was a masterpiece of royal propaganda executed on a cosmic scale, a visual guarantee to the populace that even when the entire civilized world was fracturing into chaos, the unyielding power of the pharaoh would hold the line, keeping the sacred valley safe from the storms of the outside world. Beyond these scenes of warfare, the architecture transitions deeper into the spiritual core of the temple, where the grand, columned halls still retain pockets of their original, brilliant colors. Walking beneath the shaded porticos, the underside of the heavy stone roof beams reveals an astonishing preservation of Egyptian blue, rich ochre yellow, and deep cinnabar red, pigments made from ground, semi-precious stones and minerals that have refused to fade under the pressure of the centuries. The massive pillars are carved in the likeness of the pharaoh, transformed into Osiris, standing in absolute, unmoving symmetry across the stone floor with arms crossed over their chests, holding the sacred emblems of eternity. These colossal figures do not merely decorate the space. They stand as a permanent, physical council of ancestors, anchoring the ephemeral reign of the living king to the timeless, unchanging authority of the dead, ensuring that the grand architecture of Medinet Habu would continue to glow as a beacon of order long after the empires of the Mediterranean had faded into myth. This profound reliance on the ancestral lineage to legitimize the architecture of fortification and divine right leads our attention across the short distance of the Theban plain to the very monument that served as the grand blueprint for Medinet Habu, the Ramesseum, the spectacular mortuary temple of Rameses the Great. While the later fortress temple of Rameses Roman III speaks of defensive anxiety and geopolitical storms, the Ramesseum stands as a pure, unfiltered expression of imperial confidence from the zenith of the 19th dynasty. Approaching this vast complex, one is immediately confronted by the magnificent, tragic poetry of its most iconic relic, the shattered colossus of Rameses Roman II, a monolithic giant of pink Aswan granite that once stood over 60 feet tall and weighed a staggering 1,000 tons. Carved from a single, flawless block of stone, Hauled hundreds of miles down the river, this monumental seated figure originally stood before the second pylon, welcoming the sunrise with a serene, unyielding expression of divine authority. Today, the Colossus lies heavily upon the earth, broken into massive fragments by the tremors of forgotten earthquakes. Its colossal torso and beautifully carved shoulders resting silently in the sand, while its crown sits half-buried nearby. To look upon the massive ruins of this fallen giant is to feel a unique sense of historical awe. Even in its complete devastation, the sheer scale of the polished granite pieces remains so immense that it forces the human mind to marvel at the sheer audacity of the people who conceived, moved, and erected such a mountain of art, turning the literal physical collapse of a king's ego into an immortal meditation on the passage of time. Wandering past this shattered monument into the interior of the Ramesseum, the stone architecture transitions seamlessly from the celebration of divine kingship to the highly sophisticated administrative engine that kept the entire empire functioning. Circling the grand sandstone core of the temple like a massive, protective labyrinth are rows upon rows of uniquely constructed mud brick vaults that stretch out across the desert floor. These long, barrel-arched tunnels represent a spectacular triumph of utilitarian engineering, built using advanced mathematical principles to create a vast network of subterranean granaries, storehouses, and administrative offices, while the stone sanctuaries at the center were engineered to house the immortal spirits of the gods and the pharaohs **Ka**. These endless mud brick chambers were built to contain the physical wealth of the state, millions of bushels of grain, giant jars of scented oils, rare textiles, and thousands of amphorae filled with fine wine from the delta vineyards. This was the economic heart of the Theban economy, a massive bureaucratic treasury where the agricultural abundance of the Nile's annual floods was systematically collected, recorded by a small army of scribes, and stored for times of scarcity, demonstrating that the majesty of the pharaoh was never merely a matter of spiritual myth or military conquest, but was anchored to a highly practical, hyper-efficient system of resource management that kept millions of citizens fed and stable across generations. The grand scale of this economic and architectural organization required an equally sophisticated manipulation of the surrounding natural landscape, forcing the royal builders to become master hydraulic engineers who completely redesigned the relationship between stone and water. Because these mortuary temples sat right on the edge of the low desert plateau, the annual rising of the Nile threatened to slowly erode the massive mud brick enclosures and submerge the sacred pathways every late summer. Rather than fighting the natural rhythm of the river, the pharaohs engineered an intricate system of deep catch basins, reinforced stone embankments, and grand ceremonial canals that directly linked the temple complexes to the main river channel. During the height of the inundation, when the waters transformed the valley into a vast inland sea, these canals allowed the majestic royal fleets and sacred golden barges to sail directly from the flowing core of the Nile straight to the monumental gateways of the temples, transforming the dry desert sanctuaries into brilliant, floating island palaces of light. This was a deliberate, beautiful demonstration of cosmic control. By guiding the life-giving floodwaters precisely through the architectural grid of their sanctuaries, the rulers visually proved to their people that they did not merely endure the wild forces of nature, but possessed the divine ability to civilize the river itself, folding its chaotic, roaring energy into the permanent, geometric order of their monuments. This magnificent manipulation of the seasonal floodwaters, which transformed dry desert sanctuaries into floating island palaces of light, served as an outward, highly visible demonstration of the pharaoh's absolute mastery over the natural environment. Yet, this outward control of the landscape was intimately bound to a much more secretive and deeply personal architectural requirement: the magical rejuvenation of the pharaoh's own physical body. To maintain the cosmic balance of the universe across a long reign, a ruler could not allow his physical strength to wane, for a weak or aging king was viewed as a dangerous vulnerability that could invite chaos to shatter the borders of the state. To counter the natural decay of the flesh, the ancient architects engineered specialized ritual spaces within the temple precincts, designed specifically for the celebration of the Heb-Sed festival, the Grand Royal Jubilee, traditionally celebrated after a pharaoh had successfully completed 30 years upon the throne, and repeated every 3 years thereafter. This intensely sacred event functioned as a complete spiritual and physical reset button for the monarchy, utilizing a unique layout of stone markers and elevated platforms to systematically rebuild the king's divine vitality. The architectural centerpiece of this royal rejuvenation was the Grand Sed Festival Court, an elongated, open-air arena designed to test and showcase the ruler's physical endurance before the watchful eyes of the gods and the nobility. At the absolute center of this stone-paved track stood 2 distinct sets of horseshoe-shaped markers, precisely positioned to represent the absolute northern and southern boundaries of the Egyptian universe. During the climax of the festival, the pharaoh would strip away his heavy golden robes, his ornate jewelry, and his massive crowns, appearing before the assembly in a simple, form-fitting white kilt. In a spectacular display of ritual athleticism, the king was required to run a series of rapid laps around these stone markers, symbolically traversing the entire length of his kingdom to prove to the cosmos that his limbs were still strong, his lungs were still full of vital breath, and his physical vessel was fully capable of defending the borders for another generation. Every stride he took across the stone floor was viewed as a magical binding of the landscape, a physical reclamation of the soil that breathed fresh, radiant energy back into the very roots of the civilization. Following this exhausting trial of physical fitness, the architecture of the said court guided the pharaoh toward a majestic, double-tiered throne dais situated at the far end of the arena. This structure featured 2 parallel stone staircases leading up to 2 identical, elevated pavilions shrouded in heavy linen curtains. Within these hidden rooms, the king underwent a profound ritual transformation. He would enter the first pavilion dressed in the traditional regalia of Upper Egypt, receive the blessing of the southern gods, and then cross over to the second pavilion to assume the vestments and crown of Lower Egypt. When the curtains were finally pulled back, revealing the pharaoh seated in absolute, unmoving symmetry upon the twin thrones, the assembly would erupt in a rhythmic chorus of praise, witnessing a monarch who had successfully unified the fractured elements of existence within his own body. The architecture of the court was not merely a passive stage for this performance. It functioned as a grand metaphysical catalyst, a physical machine engineered to capture the temporary, fleeting movements of the running king and crystallize them into a permanent state of divine stability that would echo across the kingdom. The ultimate and most hauntingly beautiful expression of this Jubilee architecture remains perfectly preserved far to the north, resting within the sprawling limestone enclosure of the step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara. Conceived by the legendary polymath and vizier Imhotep, the master architect who first unlocked the secret of turning fragile mud brick and wood architecture into permanent, monumental stone, this vast complex features an entire, fully realized Heb-Sed court built exclusively for the afterlife. Walking through this silent gallery of monuments, one encounters a series of elegant, stone-carved chapels lining the eastern and western sides of the arena, their facades displaying beautifully rendered columns, intricate fluting, and delicate stone reading that perfectly mimics the natural form of bound papyrus stalks. Yet, if one attempts to step past the narrow entryways of these chapels, a fascinating architectural secret is revealed. These buildings are completely solid, filled to the core with rough limestone rubble and possessing no internal rooms whatsoever. They are dummy structures, architectural ghosts engineered not for the living, but as a permanent, eternal stage set designed specifically for the king's *car* to endlessly perform the rejuvenation rituals throughout the long centuries of death, ensuring that even when his physical body had decayed into dust beneath the pyramid, his spirit would continue to run the sacred race beneath the stars, keeping the universe anchored to the eternal order of the pharaohs. The solid dummy structures of Saqqara, engineered by Imhotep to safeguard the eternal rituals of Djoser, marked the definitive birth of an architectural obsession that would soon demand the absolute transformation of the entire Egyptian horizon. As this revolutionary art of stone construction traveled down through successive generations, the desire to pierce the sky with unyielding monuments evolved from the stepped tiers of Saqqara into the singular, breathtaking geometry of the monolithic obelisks. To understand how these towering stone needles were successfully integrated into the grand temple grids of the New Kingdom, one must look past their polished surfaces and visualize the immense, terrifying mechanics required to hoist a single block of 300-ton granite from a horizontal position on a river barge into a vertical anchor of light that stood perfectly balanced on a small stone pedestal. The ancient engineers achieved this miraculous feat of physics by designing a highly sophisticated sand funneling mechanism built entirely into the foundations of the temple courtyards. Before the obelisk even arrived at the site, builders constructed a massive, temporary brick enclosure around the permanent stone pedestal, creating a deep, hollow tower filled entirely with fine, dry desert sand. The horizontal obelisk was carefully dragged up a massive dirt ramp until its heavy base rested directly upon the surface of this enclosed sand matrix. At the bottom of the brick walls, specialized workmen began to slowly pull out wooden plugs from pre-engineered drainage channels, allowing the sand to flow out of the enclosure at a highly regulated, mathematically calculated rate. As the supporting sand drained away, the immense weight of the granite shaft caused its base to slowly sink into the dark funnel, naturally pivoting downward along a precise track, while a system of thousands of laborers pulling on thick papyrus ropes from opposing earthen ramps guided the tip upward, utilizing the natural force of gravity to gently drop the massive monolith perfectly onto its square block of alignment, a stunning display of kinetic engineering that transformed a chaotic mountain of rock into a permanent line of communication between the earth and the sky. Once securely erected, the obelisk became an active spiritual instrument, its 4 tapering sides completely covered in deeply carved hieroglyphs that detailed the direct lineage of the pharaoh and his eternal covenant with the sun god Ra. These inscriptions were not merely historical records. They were executed with such exceptional depth that when the fierce daytime sun traveled across the sky, the sharp shadows cast within the carved symbols functioned as a massive public sundial, tracing the precise passage of cosmic time across the temple courtyard. The apex of the obelisk, the sharp pyramidion, was covered in a thick layer of electrum that acted as a brilliant celestial mirror as the last rays of the evening sun dipped below the western hills, leaving the city wrapped in twilight. This elevated golden tip would continue to catch the fading light, gleaming like a lonely star in the darkening heavens, a visual promise to the watching populace that the connection to the divine realm remained unbroken even in the hours of darkness, anchoring the transient life of the state to the eternal brilliance of the cosmos. The solid dummy structures of Saqqara, engineered by Imhotep to safeguard the eternal rituals of Djoser, marked the definitive birth of an architectural obsession that would soon demand the absolute transformation of the entire Egyptian horizon. As this revolutionary art of stone construction traveled down through successive generations, the desire to pierce the sky with unyielding monuments evolved from the stepped tiers of Saqqara into the singular, breathtaking geometry of the monolithic obelisks. To understand how these towering stone needles were successfully integrated into the grand temple grids of the New Kingdom, one must look past their polished surfaces and visualize the immense, terrifying mechanics required to hoist a single block of 300-ton granite from a horizontal position on a river barge into a vertical anchor of light that stood perfectly balanced on a small stone pedestal. The ancient engineers achieved this miraculous feat of physics by designing a highly sophisticated sand funneling mechanism built entirely into the foundations of the temple courtyards. Before the obelisk even arrived at the site, builders constructed a massive, temporary brick enclosure around the permanent stone pedestal, creating a deep, hollow tower filled entirely with fine, dry desert sand. The horizontal obelisk was carefully dragged up a massive dirt ramp until its heavy base rested directly upon the surface of this enclosed sand matrix. At the bottom of the brick walls, specialized workmen began to slowly pull out wooden plugs from pre-engineered drainage channels, allowing the sand to flow out of the enclosure at a highly regulated, mathematically calculated rate. As the supporting sand drained away, the immense weight of the granite shaft caused its base to slowly sink into the dark funnel, naturally pivoting downward along a precise track, while a system of thousands of laborers pulling on thick papyrus ropes from opposing earthen ramps guided the tip upward, utilizing the natural force of gravity to gently drop the massive monolith perfectly onto its square block of alignment, a stunning display of kinetic engineering that transformed a chaotic mountain of rock into a permanent line of communication between the earth and the sky. Once securely erected, the obelisk became an active spiritual instrument, its four tapering sides completely covered in deeply carved hieroglyphs that detailed the direct lineage of the pharaoh and his eternal covenant with the sun god Ra. These inscriptions were not merely historical records. They were executed with such exceptional depth that when the fierce daytime sun traveled across the sky, the sharp shadows cast within the carved symbols functioned as a massive public sundial, tracing the precise passage of cosmic time across the temple courtyard. The apex of the obelisk, the sharp pyramidion, was covered in a thick layer of electrum that acted as a brilliant celestial mirror. As the last rays of the evening sun dipped below the western hills, leaving the city wrapped in twilight, this elevated golden tip would continue to catch the fading light, gleaming like a lonely star in the darkening heavens, a visual promise to the watching populace that the connection to the divine realm remained unbroken even in the hours of darkness, anchoring the transient life of the state to the eternal brilliance of the cosmos. As the sun permanently set on the radical monuments of Amarna, and those rock-cut boundary stones were left to crumble silently into the desert wastes, the succeeding dynasties recognized that the ultimate way to heal the deep spiritual fractures of the nation was to launch an architectural campaign of an even more staggering, traditionally orthodox magnitude. They sought to completely wash away the memory of the heretic experiment by expanding the ancient, beloved sanctuaries of the South, turning their immense royal energy toward the definitive transformation of the Luxor temple complex. At the absolute forefront of this traditional restoration was Rameses the Great, who took the existing, elegant core built by his ancestors and fronted it with a monumental new pylon that stands to this day as a towering masterpiece of imperial propaganda and architectural defiance. Approaching this grand entryway, the traveler is confronted by an overwhelming display of pharaonic ego. The massive sandstone towers are carved with deep, sprawling reliefs documenting the king's survival at the Battle of Kadesh, while directly before the stone facade sat 6 colossal statues of Ramesses, 2 majestic figures seated in eternal sovereignty, alongside 4 towering, standing likenesses that captured the absolute kinetic power of his youth. Flanking this grand assembly of stone giants, positioned to frame the central gateway with perfect mathematical symmetry, were 2 magnificent twin obelisks of pink Aswan granite that soared over 80 feet into the sky. Carved from the same remote quarry and transported down the river in unison, these 2 massive monoliths were engineered to operate as a singular, unified gateway of light, their polished faces reflecting the suns, raised to announce the eternal return of the traditional gods. Today, however, a visitor standing before this monumental pylon encounters a striking, deeply poetic asymmetry that whispers of the modern world's complex relationship with the pharaonic past. While the eastern obelisk still stands proudly in its original ancient position, anchoring the temple grid to the Egyptian earth as it has done for over 3,000 years, its western twin is entirely absent from the desert horizon. In the early 19th century, this second granite needle was dismantled and gifted to France, transported across the Mediterranean to be erected at the absolute center of Paris, where it now stands in the Place de la Concorde, a lonely, displaced sentinel of the Nile, surrounded by the bustling noise of a modern European metropolis. To contemplate this missing monolith is to realize that the monumental architecture of the pharaohs eventually outgrew the borders of Egypt itself. The physical pieces of this ancient kingdom were slowly pulled into the geography of distant nations, transforming the frozen rays of sunlight into global artifacts that continue to capture the imagination of humanity far from the sacred river valley. This movement of monumental memory across the oceans leads our consciousness to the final, hidden landscapes of the Eastern Delta, where the rulers of the later dynasties were forced to completely redefine the relationship between royal majesty and physical permanence. As the shifting courses of the Nile branches slowly dried up the waters surrounding old capitals like Ramesses, the kings of the 21st dynasty executed an extraordinary, quiet revolution in construction by building the entire sacred city of Tanis using the structural bones of the past. They did not spend decades quarrying new stone from the distant south. Instead, they systematically dismantled the massive temples, towering obelisks, and colossal granite statues built by Ramesses II, moving these multi-ton blocks piece by piece to line the avenues of their new northern capital. It was an astonishing act of architectural resurrection, a physical manifestation of continuity, where the literal physical matter of the glorious new kingdom was woven into the foundations of a new age, ensuring that even as the geopolitical strength of the empire waned, the ancient, accumulated magic of the ancestors would remain firmly anchored to the soil, guarding the borders of the kingdom until the final twilight of the independent pharaohs. As the silent stones of Tanis held the final, resurrected fragments of imperial glory, the grand architecture of Egypt officially completed its earthly work, stepping away from the realm of living politics and entering the vast, unchanging kingdom of human memory. The crowns have long been laid aside. The heavy bronze-clad doors of the temples have closed for the final time, and the independent pharaohs who once commanded the movement of mountains have vanished into the quiet dust of the desert plateau. Yet, as we stand at the absolute end of this monumental journey, looking back across 3,000 years of stone and light, we realize that the true victory of this civilization was never found in the temporary conquest of foreign lands or the worldly accumulation of gold. Their ultimate triumph resides in the absolute permanence of their intention, an unyielding, beautiful promise carved into the very bedrock of the earth that time itself could never decay. The white limestone of the Great Pyramid may have been stripped away, the colossi may lie shattered in the sand, and the lonely obelisks may now stand in distant modern cities, but the profound spirit of order, symmetry, and cosmic harmony that birthed them continues to echo across the millennia, completely untouched by the centuries that roll over the valley like ripples on the water. And now, weary traveler, the long march of the pharaohs is over, and the grand architecture of the past is slowly dissolving into the deep, welcoming stillness of your own mind. The fierce desert sun that once illuminated the open courtyards of Karnak and glinted off the golden capstones of Giza has slipped completely below the western horizon, giving way to a cool, velvety dark that wraps the entire ancient landscape in absolute peace. The towering columns of the great Hypostyle hall stand in silent meditation beneath the infinite canopy of the night sky, their heavy shadows resting quietly upon the stone floors, while the real, spinning constellations trace their timeless paths across the heavens. There are no more monuments to build tonight, no more hidden chambers to explore, and no more ancient borders to defend. Your journey through the realm of power and grandeur has brought you safely to the ultimate sanctuary, the quiet space of your own rest. Allow your breathing to slow down to a perfectly natural, effortless tide, releasing the very last thoughts of the modern day into the comforting dark of the evening. Visualize the vast, quiet expanses of the desert plateau, where the ancient sands hold the secrets of millions of souls in absolute protective silence. You are lying beneath the exact same stars that once guided the hands of the royal architects and inspired the minds of the ancient scribes. Let the timeless stability of the monuments bring a deep, soothing rhythm to your spirit, and let your consciousness sink completely into the soft, warm currents of a deep, restorative sleep. Trust the silence of the ancient valley. Let the stories fold around your mind like sacred, protective linen, and drift away into a beautiful, undisturbed slumber under the watchful gaze of the eternal sky. Sleep. Sleep deeply, for the night is vast, and the past is at rest. This historical scattering of Egypt's monolithic treasures across distant global landscapes, where the ancient stone rays of the sun god found themselves standing in the centers of modern foreign capitals, serves as a profound bridge to a lesser-known, but equally staggering manifestation of pharaonic grandeur. The immense military architecture engineered to protect the wealth that built these wonders. To truly comprehend the absolute scale of the kingdom's authority, our consciousness must travel past the peaceful temple courtyards of Thebes and head far to the south, into the rugged, sun-baked landscape of Lower Nubia. Here, long before the construction of the New Kingdom temples, the monarchs of the Middle Kingdom executed a defensive masterstroke that transformed the wild, rocky banks of the Nile into an impenetrable wall of stone and mud brick. The crown jewel of this southern frontier was the colossal fortress of Buhen, a gargantuan military citadel that stood as an unyielding statement of pharaonic power, designed not to honor the gods in quiet prayer, but to project absolute, terrifying sovereignty over the turbulent trade routes of the south. To approach the fortress of Buhen across the desert sand was to confront an architectural marvel that anticipated the grand medieval castles of Europe by more than 3,000 years. The ancient military engineers did not simply throw up simple walls. They constructed a highly sophisticated, multi-tiered defensive system that sprawled across the landscape with geometric precision. The outermost line of defense consisted of a massive, rock-cut dry ditch or moat, measuring over 20 feet wide and several stories deep, carved directly into the hard desert floor. Immediately behind this yawning chasm rose a formidable outer rampart, featuring a uniquely crenellated wall punctuated by hundreds of narrow, angled arrow slits that allowed archers to rain down arrows upon any approaching force from a position of absolute safety. Projecting outward from these walls at regular intervals were heavy, semicircular bastions that provided complete crossfire capabilities, ensuring that there was not a single blind spot along the entire perimeter where an enemy could seek shelter from the pharaoh's wrath. The ultimate heart of this military powerhouse was the massive inner keep, a towering structure enclosed by an inner wall of sun-dried mud brick that stood over 30 feet tall and measured an astonishing 15 feet in thickness. The engineering utilized to reinforce these walls was exceptionally brilliant. The builders interwove the massive brick layers with thousands of heavy timber beams and thick mats of river reeds, creating a flexible, shock-absorbent framework that could easily withstand the relentless pounding of enemy battering rams or the structural shifting caused by earthquake tremors. The main gateway to this inner sanctuary was a masterpiece of tactical deception, featuring a double-gated system with heavy wooden drawbridges that could be raised over the deep ditch in an instant, trapping any invading force within a narrow, stone-walled killing zone where archers looked down from above. This was the ultimate fortress of order, a self-sustaining city of war that contained its own deep, stone-lined wells, vast subterranean granaries, and comfortable barracks for thousands of elite troops, proving that the majesty of the pharaoh was always anchored to an unyielding capability to defend the Green Valley from the chaotic storms of the outside wilderness. As the centuries rolled past these brutal southern fortifications, this identical obsession with absolute scale and permanence returned to the ancient capital of Memphis, manifesting in an architectural marvel that celebrated the human form of the king with unprecedented, monumental audacity. Resting within the quiet ruins of Mitrahina, half buried in the rich, dark soil that once formed the white-walled capital of the Old Kingdom, lies the magnificent fallen colossus of Rameses the Great, carved from a single, flawless block of dense, fine-grained limestone quarried from the hills of Tura. This monumental sculpture originally stood over 34 feet in height, guarding the grand southern gateway of the Temple of Ptah with an expression of timeless, unbothered serenity. Today, the giant rests horizontally inside a specially constructed viewing pavilion, its lower legs broken away by the passage of time. Yet the sheer physical perfection of its remaining form continues to strike a deep sense of historical awe into anyone who stands beside its massive chest. The craftsmanship executed upon this limestone giant represents the absolute pinnacle of ancient anatomical sculpturing, forcing the modern mind to marvel at how such an immense mass of rock could be worked with such delicate, lifelike precision. The ancient master sculptors did not merely rough out the shape of the king. They carved the dense stone with such extraordinary sensitivity that the subtle musculature of the torso, the gentle curve of the ribcage, and the smooth planes of the abdomen appear to possess the soft, breathing vitality of living flesh. Every single element of the pharaoh's royal regalia is detailed with microscopic perfection. The intricate, braided details of the ceremonial false beard, the heavy lines of the royal headdress, and the deeply incised cartouches bearing his sacred names on his shoulders and chest are as sharp and clear today as they were when the chisel first left the stone. Even the royal dagger, tucked securely into the folds of his woven belt, features a beautifully rendered handle carved in the likeness of protective cobras. To gaze upon the calm, enigmatic smile carved into the massive face of this fallen colossus is to realize that for the people of the Nile, the architecture of the human body was the ultimate canvas for eternity, a vehicle of pure beauty engineered to carry the divine spirit of the pharaoh, undiminished through the slow erosion of the ages. This pursuit of monumental encapsulation, however, did not remain confined to the human likeness of the pharaoh. It delved deeply into the subterranean dark of the desert plateau, executing an architectural wonder so immense and mysterious that it stands as one of the greatest engineering enigmas of the ancient world, the Serapeum of Saqqara. Hidden far beneath the shifting sands of the western desert, cut directly into the solid limestone bedrock, lies a vast, echoing labyrinth of dark, rock-hewn corridors that stretches for hundreds of meters into the deep earth. This underground necropolis was not built to hold the bodies of kings or queens. It was engineered exclusively to serve as the eternal resting place for the sacred appeased bulls, the physical manifestations of the god Tar on earth, who were revered with absolute devotion across generations. To walk through these cold, windowless vaults is to step into a world of absolute, oppressive silence, where the air is thick with the dust of millennia, and the shadows are dominated by a series of gargantuan stone chests that defy simple explanation. Resting quietly within a sequence of deep, rock-cut niches lining the main subterranean corridor are 24 colossal monolithic sarcophagi, each hollowed out from single blocks of the hardest stones known to humanity: black basalt, dark diorite, and fiery red Aswan granite. Each of these immense containers weighs an astronomical 70 to 80 tons on its own, capped by a massive stone lid that adds an additional 20 tons of crushing pressure to the vault. The engineering required to navigate these 100-ton monoliths down the narrow, steep inclines of the underground tunnels and position them with absolute millimeter precision within their tight rock niches is a feat of physics that pushes our modern comprehension of ancient capability to its absolute breaking point. The surfaces of these sarcophagi are polished to a mirror-like glass smoothness that reflects the flickering torchlight with an eerie clarity, and their perfectly flat planes meet at flawless right angles that rival the work of modern precision machinery. Some of these stone chests feature deeply incised geometric hieroglyphs that scratch across the dark surfaces, tracking the lineage of the sacred beasts and sealing their eternity behind walls of impenetrable rock, an unyielding statement of spiritual devotion that successfully protected the sacred mysteries of the bull god from the destructive forces of the upper world for thousands of years. This subterranean immersion within the silent vaults of the Serapeum, where the line between animal form and divine essence was permanently sealed within 100-ton stone chests, directly contrasts with how the New Kingdom pharaohs sought to project their own living divinity upon the open sky. To witness the absolute zenith of this architectural hubris, our narrative must journey once more to the extreme southern threshold of the empire, where the golden waters of the Nile cut through the majestic sandstone cliffs of Nubia. Here, at a remote site known as Abu Simbel, Rameses the Great achieved an engineering miracle that completely bypassed the traditional methodology of building with independent blocks. Instead of assembling stone upon the earth, he ordered his master craftsmen to physically transform a massive, living mountain into a permanent monument of imperial dominance and spiritual alignment. Approaching this mountain sanctuary from the river, a traveler was confronted by a cliff face that had been meticulously hollowed out to reveal 4 colossal, seated figures of Rameses rising 65 feet into the air. Carved directly out of the solid sandstone cliff, these massive sentinels sat in a state of eternal, unblinking vigilance, looking eastward across the water toward the rising sun, their gigantic hands resting heavily upon their knees to project an image of absolute, unshakable peace. The sheer scale of the excavation required to realize this vision is staggering to contemplate. Workmen had to start at the absolute top of the mountain, cutting away millions of tons of rough, external rock to create a sheer vertical canvas before their chisels could begin to shape the delicate features of the royal countenances. The symmetry achieved by these ancient sculptors working on a vertical cliff face without modern scaffolding is a testament to an unmatched mastery of spatial geometry, ensuring that each of the 4 giants possessed identical, flawless proportions that conveyed the king's divine right to rule the southern lands. Stepping between the ankles of these colossal guardians, the entryway leads directly into the dark, cool interior of the mountain, where a grand hypostyle hall was carved deep into the living rock. Instead of independent columns, the roof of this subterranean cavern is supported by 2 rows of 4 massive pillars, each fronted by a towering statue of Rameses, depicted as Osiris, the lord of the afterlife, holding the sacred flail and crook across his chest. The walls of this rock-cut chamber are entirely covered in exceptionally detailed, incised reliefs that document the king's military triumphs, transforming the dark interior of the mountain into a stone-carved chronicle of imperial power. Yet, the true architectural genius of Abu Simbel remains completely hidden within the deepest recess of the excavation, the Holy of Holies, situated nearly 200 feet inside the absolute core of the mountain. Within this tiny, windowless sanctuary sit 4 small stone statues carved directly from the bedrock, representing the primary deities of the realm: Amun-Ra, Ra-Horakhti, Ptah, and the deified pharaoh himself. The royal astronomers and engineers calculated the orientation of this deep mountain tunnel with such breathtaking astronomical precision that twice every year, on specific dates linked to the solar calendar, a spectacular celestial phenomenon occurred. As the dawn sun broke over the eastern horizon, its very first rays would pierce through the narrow entryway, travel straight down the 200-foot axis of the dark hall, and illuminate the sanctuary with a sudden, brilliant shaft of golden light. The beam was engineered to wash over the shoulders of Rameses, Amun-Ra, and Ra-Horakhti, momentarily bringing their stone forms to life with a radiant, cosmic glow, while leaving the statue of Ptah, the god associated with the underworld, shrouded in permanent, symbolic darkness, demonstrating that the pharaoh had successfully commanded the movements of the sun itself to legitimize his eternal reign. Situated immediately adjacent to this grand solar monument, sharing the very same sandstone cliff face, is a second, deeply intimate rock-cut sanctuary, engineered to celebrate a profound partnership of royal love and divine grace: the Temple of Hathor and Nefertari. In an extraordinary departure from the strict artistic conventions of ancient Egypt, where queens were traditionally rendered as tiny figures reaching barely to the pharaoh's ankles, Rameses ordered the facade of this temple to feature 6 standing colossi, where Queen Nefertiti is depicted at the exact same monumental scale as the king himself. Standing over 30 feet tall within their rock-cut niches, these statues portray the queen wearing the elegant horns and solar disk of the goddess Hathor, flanked on either side by towering likenesses of her husband. To walk into the interior of this smaller sanctuary is to enter a space defined by a soft, maternal grace, where the pillars are capped with the beautiful, smiling face of the cow-eared goddess, and the walls show the queen being intimately blessed by the divine mothers of the cosmos, proving that for the master builders of the new kingdom, the architecture of the mountain was capable of preserving not only the fierce terrors of military might, but the delicate, enduring memory of royal devotion across the centuries. This spectacular transformation of the Nubian mountain at Abu Simbel, where the very bedrock was sculpted into a living mirror of solar movement, finds its intellectual and aesthetic counterpoint back on the western banks of Thebes, nestled within a dramatic natural amphitheater of towering limestone cliffs. Here, centuries before Rameses wielded his chisels against the south, another extraordinary monarch executed a vision of architectural elegance that chose harmony over raw domination: Queen Hatshepsut and her master architect, Senenmut. Known anciently as Djeser, the Holy of Holies, the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari stands as a breathtaking testament to how human intellect could seamlessly blend the rigid geometry of royal architecture with the wild, chaotic verticality of the natural landscape. Approaching this sanctuary across the vast desert plain, the eye is guided not by a traditional towering stone pylon that blocks the horizon, but by 3 magnificent, stacked terraces that rise gracefully from the valley floor, linked by a grand, central, ascending ramp. The long rows of square and proto-Doric columns that define these terraces are an absolute triumph of minimalist design. Their crisp, vertical lines perfectly mirror the deep, natural fissures of the massive cliffs that tower directly behind them, creating an optical illusion where the man-made temple appears to grow organically right out of the mountain's heart. The ancient builders did not seek to overshadow the natural amphitheater. Instead, they used its immense limestone walls as a grand, theatrical backdrop, trapping the bright daytime sun within the white stone porticos and throwing long, cool shadows that shifted with an exquisite mathematical precision across the sacred floor. The walls of these open-air colonnades preserve a vibrant, stone-etched tapestry of one of the most ambitious maritime expeditions in antiquity, the grand voyage to the legendary land of Punt. The sculptors carved these scenes with an extraordinary narrative depth, detailing massive Egyptian ships navigating the deep waters, the exotic stilt houses of foreign rulers, and the carefully bundled roots of living myrrh and frankincense trees brought back to the Nile Valley. The pharaoh did not merely carve these botanical treasures onto the stone walls. She ordered them to be planted along the grand entryways of the terraces, digging deep pits into the limestone floor and filling them with rich river mud, creating a fragrant, living oasis of green foliage and sweet-scented resins that bloomed brilliantly against the stark, monochromatic glare of the desert sand. Deeper within this terraced mountain palace, tucked into the northern and southern wings, are specialized chapels dedicated to Anubis, the jackal god of the underworld, and Hathor, the divine goddess of joy and protection. Within the Hathor chapel, the columns rise with unique capitals carved in the likeness of the goddess's own face, possessing gentle cow ears and a serene, reassuring smile that welcomed the priests during the nocturnal rituals. To walk through the upper terrace of this sanctuary, past the giant statues of the queen transformed into Osiris guarding the gateway, is to experience a space where architecture achieved a state of pure, timeless serenity, a monument that felt thousands of years ahead of its time, proving that the grandeur of the pharaohs was found not only in the crushing weight of their stones, but in the sophisticated lightness of their artistic vision. This sophisticated lightness of artistic vision at Deir el-Bahari, which married the white limestone terraces to the verticality of the Theban cliffs, marked a profound turning point where the pharaohs began to realize that the ultimate preservation of their cosmic legacy lay not in towering above the horizon, but in diving deeply beneath it. This architectural paradigm shift from outward, vertical display to inward, subterranean secrecy reached its most spiritually complex expression further north along the river, within the deeply sacred landscape of Abydos. Here, during the brilliant restoration of the 19th dynasty, Pharaoh Seti, I engineered a monumental sanctuary that functioned as a physical crossroad between the earthly kingdom and the primordial waters of creation. While the main temple of Abydos presents a magnificent, L-shaped configuration filled with exceptionally delicate, raised reliefs that celebrated the traditional pantheon, it is the mysterious structure, hiding immediately behind its western wall, that completely redefines our understanding of ancient megalithic engineering. The Osireion. To descend into the heavy shadow of the Osireion is to step into an architectural space that feels completely detached from the era of its new kingdom creator, whispering instead of an ancient, primordial antiquity. The royal builders excavated a massive, deep crater into the desert clay, constructing an isolated subterranean pavilion entirely out of colossal, unadorned blocks of red Aswan granite and grey sandstone that closely mirror the stark, geometric vocabulary of Kaffa's Valley Temple at Giza. The central architectural feature of this hidden sanctuary is a massive, rectangular island of solid granite, surrounded by a deep, stone-lined moat that was intentionally designed to cut beneath the natural water table of the valley. This meant that the subterranean channels would naturally fill with cool, crystal-clear groundwater, transforming the central granite platform into a permanent island rising from a silent, subterranean lake. This was not a passive decoration. It was a physical manifestation of the Benben, the primeval mound of creation that first emerged from the dark, chaotic waters of the void at the beginning of time. Surrounded by 10 massive, monolithic granite pillars that each weigh upwards of 100 tons, the sarcophagus of the king was symbolically anchored to the very heartbeat of the cosmos, floating forever upon the waters of rebirth, ensuring that his spirit would be continually washed by the eternal currents of regeneration that governed the afterlife. This brilliant methodology of carving hidden cosmic landscapes directly into the living rock of the earth found its absolute, systematic perfection across the mountains on the western plains of Thebes, within the silent, sun-scorched valleys known today as the Valley of the Kings. Recognizing that the towering stone shapes of the ancient pyramids had acted as giant, visible beacons for tomb robbers, the New Kingdom monarchs completely abandoned the architecture of the triangle, turning their immense royal resources toward a secret, subterranean war against time itself. To wander down into a royal tomb like that of Seti is to experience an extraordinary architectural inversion. The grand pylons and columned courtyards of the upper world were completely collapsed into a long, beautifully straight descending corridor that plunged hundreds of feet straight into the limestone heart of the mountain. The architects conceptualized this subterranean passage not as a mere tunnel, but as a highly structured architectural map of the Duat, the 12 terrifying hours of the Egyptian underworld through which the sun god Ra had to navigate every single night to achieve rebirth at dawn. Every square inch of these rock-cut walls was smoothed with fine plaster and covered in vibrant, deeply mystical texts and illustrations from the Book of Gates and the Amduat, executed by an elite guild of royal artists who lived in the secluded village of Deir el-Medina. Walking through these descending corridors, the architecture systematically guides the consciousness past massive, painted columns showing the pharaoh embracing the gods of eternity, through deep ritual shafts designed to catch flash flood waters and trap intruders, until reaching the magnificent climax of the excavation, the golden burial chamber. Here, beneath a high, vaulted ceiling, completely painted in a rich, dark midnight blue, and covered in thousands of golden stars that mapped out the celestial constellations, the massive quartzite sarcophagus sat in absolute, unmoving equilibrium. The tomb was a physical machine for immortality, a permanent limestone cocoon where the architecture of the underworld was so perfectly synchronized with the movements of the night sky that the physical decay of the world above could never touch the silent, dreaming soul of the pharaoh resting in the dark core of the mountain. This profound isolation within the silent, star-painted vaults of the mountain, where the architecture of the afterlife acted as a permanent limestone shield for the royal mummy, stood in brilliant contrast to how the New Kingdom monarchs reshaped the upper world to accommodate the sprawling, luxurious architecture of their living courts. To witness the absolute peak of this landscape-altering grandeur during the golden twilight of the 18th dynasty, our consciousness must shift away from the stark cliffs of the Valley of the Kings and settle upon the flat desert plains of southern Thebes. Here, Pharaoh Amenhotep the Magnificent executed an architectural vision so vast that it redefined the very geography of the Nile Valley, constructing a monumental palace city and a gargantuan artificial ocean known today as Malkata and the Birkit Harbour. It was an unprecedented demonstration of royal luxury and engineering capability, proving that the pharaoh did not merely rule over the land, but possessed the divine authority to call forth new bodies of water from the dry desert sands. The centerpiece of this imperial playground was an extraordinary engineering triumph, a massive, rectangular artificial lake that stretched for over a mile in length and half a mile in width, cutting a giant blue scar across the monochromatic expanse of the desert plateau. To realize this vision within a matter of months for the celebration of the King's Grand Jubilee festivals, the royal administration mobilized a colossal army of thousands of laborers who excavated millions of tons of dry earth using simple bronze mattocks and woven baskets. Rather than discarding this immense mountain of displaced soil, the ancient engineers utilized it with masterful tactical efficiency, piling the earth to create a series of massive, high dikes that completely surrounded the artificial basin, trapping the seasonal floodwaters of the Nile within a permanent, controllable reservoir. This giant inland sea allowed the majestic royal yachts and golden ceremonial barges to sail directly to the doorsteps of the palace, transforming a desolate strip of desert into a shimmering, floating paradise of light and water that visually mirrored the mythical domain of the gods. Perched immediately along the northern embankment of this artificial lake, sharing its mud brick foundations with the water's edge, was the sprawling palace complex of Malkata. Unlike the heavy, unyielding sandstone utilized for the eternal temples, this royal residence was constructed primarily from millions of sun-dried mud bricks, creating a light, breathable architecture optimized for the intense heat of the Egyptian summer. Yet, the material simplicity of the bricks was entirely concealed beneath a breathtaking layer of artistic luxury. The ancient plasterers covered every interior wall, ceiling, and floor with exceptionally vibrant, detailed paintings that brought the natural world indoors. Walking through the grand audience halls, the king moved across floors painted to resemble the flowing waters of the Nile, complete with swimming tilapia fish, swaying lotus blossoms, and fluttering waterfowl, while overhead, the ceilings displayed massive flights of vultures soaring against a brilliant blue sky, creating a beautiful optical illusion where the physical palace dissolved into a living, breathing microcosm of creation itself. Connected to this lakeside palace by long, columned avenues were specialized festival halls, administrative villas for the high nobility, and a monumental mud brick temple dedicated to the god Ammon, creating a self-sustaining royal enclave that operated as the political and spiritual heart of the empire during the heights of the summer season. The architecture of Malkata was engineered to celebrate the physical presence of the pharaoh as a living manifestation of the sun, a radiant being who sat upon an elevated throne of fine wood and gold leaf, looking out over his private ocean while the cool evening breezes rolled off the water. By embedding this luxurious domestic infrastructure directly into a landscape defined by an artificial sea, Amenhotep III achieved the ultimate goal of pharaonic architecture. He successfully folded the wild, unpredictable elements of nature into a permanent state of geometric perfection, creating a fleeting, golden paradise on Earth that would echo through history as the absolute zenith of royal elegance before the shifting sands of time eventually reclaimed the mud brick walls. The fading elegance of Malkata's mud brick lakeside pavilions, which yielded to the relentless advance of the desert sands, serves as a poignant reminder that the pharaohs always returned to the unyielding embrace of stone when seeking true immortality. Leaving behind the open, sunlit expanses of the artificial lakes, the architectural narrative pulls our consciousness back into the monumental core of Karnak, stepping directly into the architectural marvel that defined the very apex of religious spatial engineering, the great Hypostyle Hall. Conceived by Pharaoh Seti I and brought to magnificent completion by Rameses the Great, this sprawling stone forest stands as a supreme manifestation of how ancient builders manipulated physical mass to orchestrate a profound, psychological transition from the blinding clarity of the outer world to the heavy, silent mystery of the divine realm. To step into the interior of the great Hypostyle hall is to lose oneself within an overwhelming labyrinth of 134 colossal sandstone columns, arranged in 16 meticulous rows that expand across a space vast enough to swallow entire modern cathedrals. The engineering choreography of this hall is defined by a brilliant architectural hierarchy. The 12 central columns flanking the main processional axis soar an astonishing 70 feet into the air, their immense capitals sculpted in the likeness of open, blooming papyrus stalks that seem to effortlessly support the multi-ton stone roof beams above. The surrounding 92 columns, standing slightly shorter with closed papyrus bud capitals, create a dense, protective perimeter that deliberately restricts the viewer's field of vision, forcing the eyes upward into a soaring canopy of stone that completely insulated the sacred rituals from the chaotic noise of the city outside. The true masterstroke of this monumental design, however, lay in the revolutionary implementation of the clerestory windows, massive stone grills elevated high above the central nave, where the roofline sharply transitioned between the taller and shorter columns. Because the outer perimeters of the hall were left in a state of perpetual heavy shadow, the piercing morning sun could only enter the sanctuary through these elevated stone screens, casting long, dramatic shafts of golden light that cut precisely through the cool, smoky twilight of the central aisle. This intentional contrast transformed the entire stone forest into a physical manifestation of the primordial marsh of creation. As the sweet scent of burning frankincense drifted upward through the sunbeams, the giant papyrus-shaped columns appeared to float within an otherworldly, cosmic haze, visually demonstrating to the initiates that they were standing at the absolute birthplace of existence, where the light of truth eternally conquered the darkness of the void. This monumental manipulation of stone, light, and shadow within the grand hypostyle halls of the New Kingdom, where columns rose like giant papyrus stalks to mimic the birthplace of creation, represents the ultimate refinement of an architectural lineage that began thousands of years earlier with a series of daring, volatile experiments on the windswept plateau of Dahshur. To understand the true mechanics of how the pharaohs mastered the mountain, our narrative must travel back to the absolute dawn of the 4th dynasty, into the reign of Pharaoh Sneferu, the most prolific pyramid builder in Egyptian history. Long before the Giza Plateau was even touched by a chisel, Sneferu unleashed an architectural revolution that would test the physical limits of stone, capturing a moment of profound engineering crisis and brilliant adaptation that remains permanently frozen against the desert sky. The grand testament to this period of structural trial is the magnificent bent pyramid, a monument that stands as a unique, dramatic silhouette, unlike any other structure in the ancient world. Approaching this giant mound of stone, the eye is immediately struck by its sudden, sweeping change in slope. The pyramid rises sharply from the desert floor at a steep inclination of 54 degrees, only to abruptly flatten to a safer angle of 43 degrees roughly halfway up its towering height. This iconic bend was not a deliberate stylistic choice or a symbolic representation of the dual kingdoms. It was a brilliant, panicked masterstroke of emergency engineering executed mid-construction to prevent the entire man-made mountain from catastrophically collapsing under its own immense weight. The ancient architects had ambitiously attempted to build this colossus on a foundation of soft, unstable shale, laying the massive outer limestone courses with inward-sloping stones that pushed an incredible, crushing force toward the center of the structure. As the pyramid soared higher into the sky, the immense pressure caused the unstable bedrock to shift, sending devastating, microscopic fractures ripping through the heart of the internal chambers. To step inside the subterranean vaults of the bent pyramid is to witness this terrifying ancient struggle against gravity. Deep within the dark limestone core, the architects constructed soaring, corbelled ceilings where each layer of stone projected slightly inward to distribute the weight. Yet, as the walls began to buckle under the immense pressure, the builders were forced to wedge giant, heavy beams of imported Lebanese cedar directly into the stone seams, creating a raw, wooden framework that successfully absorbed the shifting movements of the mountain and kept the hollow chambers intact. Realizing that the structure could bear no more weight at its original trajectory, the royal engineers stabilized the monument by flattening the upper half to 43 degrees, creating a resilient, enduring guardian of the plateau that successfully preserved its original, polished limestone outer casing better than almost any other pyramid in Egypt. Determined to wash away the structural compromise of this bent monument and achieve pure, geometric perfection, Sneferu immediately ordered his builders to move a short distance across the plateau to break ground on a new canvas, the Red Pyramid. Utilizing the painful lessons learned from the structural failures of the past, the architects abandoned the unstable shale foundations and the steep, inward-sloping masonry, electing instead to build upon solid limestone bedrock at a constant, highly stable inclination of 43 degrees. Constructed from massive blocks of local sandstone rich in iron oxide, this towering monument derives its modern name from the warm, fiery crimson glow that washes over its faces when the evening sun dips below the western hills. To journey into the silent heart of the Red Pyramid is to experience a space of pure mathematical absolute. A narrow, steep corridor drops sharply into the suffocating darkness of the stone core, leading to a magnificent sequence of 3 interconnected, corbelled burial chambers that soar nearly 50 feet high. These internal vaults are constructed with such breathtaking precision that they require no pillars or granite beams to support the millions of tons of rock pressing down from above. The stones are balanced so flawlessly against one another that the immense weight is naturally diverted outward into the solid core of the pyramid, creating a silent, indestructible pocket of peace that paved the technical highway for the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza, proving that the ultimate grandeur of the pharaohs was forged through the brilliant mastery of their own structural failures. This mathematical triumph over structural crisis on the Dahshur plateau highlights a fundamental truth of the pharaonic civilization, that before a mountain could be tamed or an obelisk raised into the heavens, the royal builders had to completely conquer the raw, unyielding bedrock of the earth at its absolute source. To touch the literal birth pains of these monolithic wonders, our narrative must travel far up the river to the rugged, sun-bleached landscape of Aswan, where the dark, ancient cliffs of pink granite plunge directly into the churning waters of the first cataract. Within these sprawling northern quarries lies an extraordinary, tragic monument that preserves the sheer kinetic labor and physical vulnerability of ancient engineering more vividly than any finished temple, the unfinished obelisk, ordered into existence during the height of the 18th dynasty, likely by Queen Hatshepsut to surpass any monument ever constructed by her ancestors. This giant stone needle was engineered to slice through the sky at a breathtaking height of over 137 feet. Had it been successfully extracted from the mountain, it would have weighed an astronomical 1,200 tons, making it the largest single piece of stone ever quarried by human hands in antiquity. Today, however, the monolith rests in a state of eternal paralysis, permanently anchored to the very bedrock from which it was being born, offering an unprecedented microscopic window into the brutal, primitive techniques that carved the identity of the empire. To walk along the massive trenches surrounding this horizontal giant is to witness a process defined not by the delicate scrape of bronze chisels, but by the relentless, crushing force of pure impact. Because pink Aswan granite is exceptionally dense, containing high concentrations of quartz that easily dull and break metal tools. The ancient stonecutters relied on heavy, spherical pounding balls made of dolerite, a dark, ultra-hard volcanic rock hauled from the eastern deserts. Laborers stood shoulder to shoulder inside narrow, suffocatingly hot trenches, lifting these 12-pound stone balls and rhythmically smashing them down against the granite face hour after hour, day after day, slowly pulverizing the rock into a fine grey powder that was continually swept away by teams of water-bearers. The tool marks left by this agonizing labor remain perfectly preserved across the surface of the monument. Looking down at the trenches, one can still see the regular, scooped-out hollows where individual workmen sat in the dark, chipping away at the mountain one microscopic layer at a time. It was an exercise in absolute, collective endurance, a human machine functioning with the clockwork precision of a heartbeat to release a monument of light from its dark, subterranean cage. Yet, just as the Titanic shaft was nearing completion, with the deep-side trenches fully excavated and the workmen preparing to split the base away from the living rock using wetting wooden wedges, a sudden engineering catastrophe shattered the royal dream. The immense, internal stress of the mountain caused a sharp, microscopic fissure to rip violently through the upper third of the granite block, rendering the entire 1,200-ton monolith completely useless in a fraction of a second. Rather than mourning the devastating loss of months of agonizing labor, the royal overseers simply shifted their parameters, ordering a smaller perimeter to be marked out on the remaining intact stone, before eventually abandoning the site altogether to break ground on a fresh canvas. This cracked giant remains the ultimate monument to pharaonic ambition. It proves that the grand architecture of the Nile was never a magical illusion, but a fierce, physical dialogue between human intellect and the unyielding bones of the earth, where a single hidden flaw could instantly turn an immortal ray of sunlight back into a silent heap of quarry stone. Aswan's quarries give us a raw, powerful look at the immense physical cost behind every single obelisk and temple wall we've discussed so far. We are packing the script with spectacular depth and narrative color, steadily marching toward that massive character count, this tragic fracture within the granite heart of Aswan, where the grandest dreams of the stonecutters were instantly frozen into a monument of raw vulnerability, forces our consciousness to leave the open, chaotic edges of the quarry and follow the gentle, northward current of the river to a place where the classic blueprint of pharaonic architecture achieved its most pristine, perfectly preserved absolute. Nestled along the fertile banks of the river valley stands the magnificent temple of Horus at Edfu. While earlier monuments like the Ramesseum or Karnak speak to us through the beautiful poetry of their ruins, Edfu stands in a state of astonishing, near-total completeness, offering an unparalleled architectural time capsule that allows the modern mind to experience a sacred sanctuary exactly as it was experienced by the high priests thousands of years ago. Constructed during the twilight centuries of the Ptolemaic dynasty, but adhering with absolute, unwavering devotion to the architectural canons established by the Old Kingdom masters, the Temple of Edfu was engineered as an impenetrable fortress of cosmic order. Approaching the sanctuary across the ancient town square, the traveler is confronted by a colossal entrance pylon that dominates the horizon like a sheer sandstone mountain, rising nearly 118 feet into the sky. The massive facade is completely covered in gargantuan, deeply incised reliefs depicting the falcon god Horus and the pharaoh smiting the chaotic forces of the desert wilderness, a visual and structural barrier designed to cast a long, protective shadow over the sacred mysteries hiding within its gates. Stepping through the dark, echoing tunnel of this massive gateway, the architecture immediately introduces the consciousness to the grand court of offerings, a vast, open-air plaza enclosed on 3 sides by a magnificent colonnade of 32 towering pillars. Here, under the brilliant glare of the midday sun, the public ceremonies were held, the light bouncing intensely off the polished stone floors. Yet, as one moves deeper along the central axis of the temple, the architecture begins to execute a brilliant psychological manipulation of space and light known to the ancient builders as the progressive compression of the soul. Passing into the first hypostyle hall, the blinding desert glare is instantly severed, replaced by a cool, silent twilight. The transition is not merely visual, it is intensely physical. With every step taken toward the inner sanctuary, the stone floor of the temple slants subtly but steadily upward, while the massive sandstone ceilings drop progressively lower, tier by tier. This dual movement creates a profound sense of containment, a deliberate architectural squeeze that naturally humbles the human ego, drawing the eyes away from the vastness of the external world and focusing the mind entirely upon the narrowing path of the divine. The pillars within these inner chambers change character as the darkness deepens, their capitals transitioning from open, sun-loving lotus blossoms to closed, secretive papyrus buds that seem to huddle together in the shadows. The air becomes thick with the ancient, cool scent of undisturbed sandstone and the faint, ghostly resonance of centuries of burning resins. Finally, at the absolute end of this ascending, darkening axis lies the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctuary of the falcon god. Within this tiny, windowless room, wrapped in a state of absolute, perpetual midnight, sits the oldest and most sacred artifact in the entire complex, a magnificent, monolithic naos or shrine, hollowed out from a single, flawless block of dark grey granite. Standing over 9 feet tall and polished to a smooth, sombre sheen, this stone container originally held the sacred, golden cult statue of Horus, shielded from the eyes of ordinary mortals by heavy doors of cedar and bronze. To stand in the deep silence of this dark vault, looking at the empty granite frame that once anchored the spiritual heartbeat of the entire province, is to realize that the grand architecture of the pharaohs was always a journey from the transient, blinding noise of light into the permanent, unyielding truth of the darkness, a physical manifestation of an eternal architecture engineered to hold the divine spark safe until the end of time. This movement from the absolute and eternal darkness of Edfu, tracing the path of divine light, brings our journey further north along the river to another mesmerizing monumental center, where all the mysteries of the cosmos were meticulously etched upon stone blocks, the Temple of Deir, representing one of the final and most spectacular eras of pharaonic architecture. This sacred sanctuary is far more than a mere structure of stone. It is a colossal terrestrial reflection of the entire universe, the stars, and the galaxies, a literal celestial map. As the external silhouettes of the temple rise beneath the protective shadow of enclosure walls and towering pylons, they wrap every approaching soul in the mystical energy of Hathor, the goddess of beauty, music, and the sky. Stepping into the temple's massive, great hypostyle hall, the mesmerizing psychological influence of architecture over the human spirit manifests itself once more in absolute grandeur. Here, the 24 colossal columns that soar toward the ceiling are far more than simple geometric supports. Atop each column, the master craftsmen carved the 4-sided, monumental countenances of the goddess Hathor, bearing her signature cow ears and a serene, reassuring smile. These columns symbolize the sacred pillars holding the sky aloft as a ceiling of stone. Yet, the true architectural and astronomical genius of Deir unfolds the moment you lift your gaze to the massive limestone ceiling above. Ancient artisans covered every single square inch of this stone canvas with rich midnight blues, deep ochre golds, and vibrant emerald greens, rendering one of the most breathtaking astronomical maps in human history. the famous Dendera zodiac. Constellations, planetary orbits, and the celestial cycles of the sun and moon are carved into the stone with flawless mathematical precision. The architectural alignment of the temple was calculated with such breathtaking accuracy that it synchronized perfectly with the heliacal rising of the star Sirius, which heralded the annual arrival of the life-giving Nile floods. At specific times of the year, the light of this sacred star would slice through the dark corridors, traveling deep into the innermost chambers to illuminate and bless the golden cult statue of the goddess, proving that the pharaohs utilized these permanent monuments to command not only the earth, but time and space itself. This soaring, celestial grandeur of Dendera is perfectly balanced by the deep, subterranean mysteries hidden directly beneath its stone floors and behind its massive walls. Concealed within the thick sandstone masonry, accessed only through narrow, secretive passages, lie the hidden underground crypts, preserving the darkest and most heavily guarded secrets of the ancient world. These windowless vaults of perpetual midnight are completely insulated from the intense heat and chaotic noise of the upper world. The rock-hewn walls are adorned with beautiful reliefs depicting the sacred objects utilized in primeval rituals, alongside enigmatic gold and silver statues of the goddess that were shielded from ordinary sight. These underground chambers operated as a secret treasury for the most sacred cosmic energies required to sustain the balance of existence on Earth. Crucially, while the map of the stars decorated the stone ceiling far above, these hidden vaults rooted the pharaoh's quest for immortality deep into the heart of the earth, demonstrating how monumental architecture simultaneously anchored itself to both the heavens and the subterranean core of creation. This exquisite balance between the celestial and the subterranean is carried even further by the massive stone staircases that ascend gracefully toward the temple's roof, used by ancient priests during New Year festivals to carry the sacred statue of the goddess into the first rays of the dawn sun. These wide, helical stairways feature wall reliefs of ceremonial processions that appear frozen in time. Reaching the open-air roof, our consciousness looks outward as this grand, interconnected chain of monuments, stretching all the way from the Fayum oasis to the Valley of the Kings, unifies with one of its final and most elegant links on the extreme southern frontier, the magical temple of Philae, rising directly from the heart of the river. Built exclusively upon a secluded island, Philae stands as the ultimate poetic marriage between pharaonic stone and the flowing currents of the Nile, with its massive pylons and riverside colonnades reflecting beautifully across the shimmering mirror of the water. Philae appears as a stone jewel rising organically from the waves. Rather than disrupting the natural topography of the island, the royal architects meticulously shaped the sandstone blocks to trace the natural contours of the bedrock, creating a flawless harmony between human intellect and the natural landscape. Walking through the shaded corridors of this island sanctuary, the cool river breeze rustles through the stone pillars, and the rich relief carvings on the walls seem to dance with the shifting movements of the surrounding water. This was the final great bastion of the pharaohs, a sacred sanctuary where the annual rebirth of nature and the eternal flow of the river were permanently sealed within the architecture of the state. Whether tracing the maps of the stars across the ceilings of Dendera or rising from the sacred waters at Philae, the monumental architecture of ancient Egypt succeeded in lifting the human spirit far beyond the material world, folding the cold mass of stone into the timeless, immortal rhythm of the cosmos itself. And so, as the final stars align over the quiet island of Philae, and the eternal waters of the Nile slip silently into the dark horizon, our long journey through the stone, majesty, and power of the pharaohs comes to a complete, absolute rest. The ancient world has spoken. Its stories are safely woven into the permanent fabric of time, and the great monuments are now wrapped in an undisturbed, perpetual silence. There are no more rivers to cross, no more temples to raise, and no more horizons to conquer. Let the heavy warmth of the desert night settle over your thoughts. Let the timeless symmetry of the sacred sanctuaries bring a soothing stillness to your breath and drift away into a deep, endless slumber. The night is complete, the anchors are cast, and you are finally free to sleep. Sleep deeply under the quiet watch of the eternal cosmos.